Hey guys, tonight we're easing into one of those chapters of history that's equal parts scandal, sorrow, and, let's be honest, extremely awkward candle placement. We're heading deep into the smoky, stew-scented back streets of the medieval city, to places where the walls were thin, the rules were thinner, and the velvet curtains only half-heartedly tried to hide what was going on. That's right, we're talking about medieval brothels. Now just so you know, you probably won't survive this. Not emotionally, not psychologically, and definitely not if you're squeamish about disease or the smell of unwashed tights. Medieval brothels weren't exactly 5-star inns with spa options, but that's the whole fun of it. We're going to step behind the heavy oak doors and find out what really happened in these places that officially weren't supposed to exist, but somehow did. A lot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? I promise I'll read them all, probably while lying in bed questioning the entire course of Western civilization. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, picture this, a flickering alleyway near the market square. It smells like overripe cheese and wet wool. There's a door painted with a subtle red streak, not enough to say brothel, but enough that if you knew, you knew. You push inside. Laughter echoes off the stone. There's a woman in a bright green veil beckoning from a staircase. A fire burns low. Somewhere upstairs someone groans, but not like in pain. Welcome to the medieval brothel. These weren't just dens of sin tucked into the shadows, they were institutions. Legal ones often, taxed, regulated and strategically placed near military barracks or pilgrimage routes. And here's the fun twist. They existed in a weird moral loophole where cities condemned prostitution in sermons, but quietly collected taxes from it behind closed doors. Imagine a town council wagging its finger by day and rubbing its hands together by night. That's basically it. Let's take the city of Toulouse, for example. In the 14th century, the city council passed laws requiring prostitutes to wear a specific striped hood. This wasn't about safety. It was so everyone could identify them and not accidentally sin. Meanwhile, the council directly profited from the very brothels these women worked in. Moral clarity? Not so much. Public sin, private profit. Brothels came in all sizes. There were massive city-sponsored establishments like the stew houses in London's Suffolk district, essentially sex malls with bathhouses attached. There were also little operations run out of someone's back room with a creaky cot and a pitcher of sour ale. But one thing stayed consistent. They were loud, chaotic and deeply woven into the urban fabric. You'd hear them before you saw them. Music, laughter, the occasional drunken lute solo. And unlike the upper floors of noble homes where everything was candlelit restraint, brothels were garish. Think heavy perfumes trying to mask body odour, overly embroidered cushions and bizarre painted ceiling scenes of swans doing suspicious things. The decor was meant to distract from how cold the stone walls were and how scratchy the linens felt. The people inside, equally colourful. Brothel workers, known in various places as public women, amies amoureuses, or just single women, came from every background imaginable. Some had fled abusive homes, others had been sold into the trade, and a few, very few, actually chose it for independence and income. There's a historical debate still raging on that point. How much agency did these women really have? Some scholars argue brothels offered one of the only ways for women to earn money without a husband or male guardian. Others point to the systemic coercion baked into the very structure. Truth is, it depended on the city, the decade, and the individual. But here's a quirky side note. In certain cities, brothels had designated safe days. These were often during religious festivals where prostitution was temporarily banned, so naturally those were the slowest and most awkward days of the year. That said, loopholes always existed. In Avignon, brothels sometimes offered spiritual massage during banned periods. No, it wasn't that spiritual. As the night deepens, the space transforms. The clients trickle in, merchants, knights, scribes, even monks sneaking out in their woolen habits. Some are regulars, some are tourists, most are drunk. They haggle over prices in hushed tones, not because it's a secret, but because they don't want to look cheap. Upstairs, the real business unfolds, often with one eye on the door, and the other on the candle burning down too close to the thatch. And it's not just sex. In a strange way, brothels also offered something softer: conversation, laughter, music. For men who spent their days in violent, rigidly hierarchical worlds, this was a weird kind of freedom, even if they had to pay for it. One fact we know: medieval brothels had curfews. Workers were expected to be inside by dusk or face fines. City ordinances would specify when they could work, what they could wear, and where they could stand. It was micromanagement at its most hypocritical, especially from city leaders who often dropped by after meetings. And the irony didn't stop there. In some towns, brothel profits funded church repairs. You heard that right. Stained glass windows gleamed thanks to coin dropped on stained pillows. So, as we settle into the world behind those low-lit wooden doors, get ready. Because the deeper we go, the stranger, sadder, and more surprising it gets. There are dark corridors ahead, filled with hypocrisy, resilience, and more than a few silk garters. It's early morning now, and the brothel is strangely quiet. The fire's burned down to embers. The perfume has mixed into something that smells like mouldy lavender and regrets, and a few of the workers, still in half-rolled stockings, stumble downstairs in search of cold bread or a forgotten cider cup. You're still here, lurking in a corner like a ghost, watching the aftermath settle like dust. And maybe you're wondering, how did all this even become normal? Why would cities that claim to be godly, moral and upright allow these places to flourish just a short walk from the cathedral? Well, surprise, it was all about profit and control. In a very medieval plot twist, cities figured out that while they couldn't stop people from sinning, they could tax it. And so they did, with astonishing efficiency. Let's take a closer look at one city that absolutely perfected the art of sinful capitalism: Nuremberg in the 15th century. Officials there ran what was effectively a municipal brothel. That's right. The city itself owned the building, hired the madam, and enforced the rules. The goal wasn't exactly charity, it was containment. Better to have sex work happening in a designated zone than have it spill into respectable neighbourhoods, or worse, result in affairs that complicated property rights. Gasp. Property was sacred after all. Prostitution was considered a necessary evil, something you tolerated to prevent worse outcomes, like, heaven forbid, adultery or monks seducing stable boys. So city councils set up red light districts. They made laws about how the brothel workers had to dress. They taxed their earnings and used the funds for very serious things, like bridge repairs and wall maintenance. Next time you admire the Gothic arches of some charming medieval town, just remember, it may have been financed by someone's drunken Saturday night. This public-private brothel system was so efficient, it makes modern zoning laws look lazy. In Florence, for example, you could find entire neighbourhoods zoned for sex work, conveniently located near markets and ports, because supply and demand, baby. And if a brothel opened too close to a convent, well, that just meant the convent would petition for a bigger wall. There was a deep, quiet hypocrisy running through all of it. Publicly, brothels were condemned as moral cancer. Sermons railed against them. Priests warned of hellfire. But in back rooms, city fathers nodded along with madams over rent contracts and tax ledgers. It wasn't unusual for the same man who signed an order finding a prostitute to also be one of her clients, or her landlord. And then there were the sin taxes. These weren't just random fees. Cities created entire economic models around the earnings from brothels. In Paris, fines collected from sex workers helped pay for public fountains and sanitation, an ironic little cycle where women were punished and then funded the public baths they were banned from using. Here's a quirky side note. In some places, brothels were only allowed to operate on certain days of the week. Sundays were usually off limits, of course, because God was watching a little more closely then. But there were also weird regional customs, like in Bruges, where the brothel district had a curfew that started when the cathedral bells rang for evening prayer, unless, of course, the bell ringer was late, which he sometimes was, conveniently. And get this, some cities even hosted inspections. Officials would visit brothels to ensure they were operating morally. Imagine a bureaucrat with a wax-sealed clipboard checking bedsheets for appropriateness and making sure the music wasn't too seductive. That's the level of absurd micromanagement we're talking about. There's actually a real debate among historians about whether these inspections were legit governance or just a socially accepted excuse for voyeurism. I mean, how closely do you really need to inspect a feather mattress to confirm it's up to code? But the biggest reason cities loved brothels wasn't just tax revenue, it was control. Control over women, over the working class, over sexual behaviour itself. By forcing brothels into specific districts and subjecting workers to humiliating laws, like mandatory clothing or curfews, they reinforced social hierarchies. You knew who was in and who was out, who was respectable and who wasn't. And if a woman crossed that line even once, good luck ever getting back. And here's the thing. Once you were labelled a prostitute, that identity stuck like medieval mud. It didn't matter why you entered the trade. Maybe your husband died, maybe you were orphaned, maybe your dowry got lost in a fire. Once you were in, the system made sure you stayed there. Even if you left the brothel and married a baker, you were still that woman from down the lane. In some cities, brothel workers were required to register with local officials. They had little books or tokens identifying them as legal sex workers. Sound helpful? It wasn't. It made them easier to fine, track, and sometimes imprison if they broke a rule, like being seen outside their district without a chaperone. Yes, grown women had to ask permission to cross the city wall, but there were some surprising exceptions. In Venice, for example, courtesans, essentially high-end sex workers, could achieve celebrity status. They wrote poetry, hosted salons, and dressed like aristocrats. And while the city still taxed and regulated them, it also kind of admired them. There's a story about a Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco who debated a bishop in public and won. So not all brothels were created equal. Some were grim little dens, others were decadent lounges where Latin philosophers recited sonnets after sex. Seriously. The contrast between those levels, the desperate workers in back-alley hovels and the silk-draped courtesans of the upper floors, reminds you how class ran straight through every part of this system. Even sex had a hierarchy. And we haven't even touched the fines yet. Oh, the fines. Workers could be fined for drinking too much, for wearing the wrong shoes, for laughing too loudly in public, basically existing. One city mandated that prostitutes wear bells on their clothing so good women could avoid them. Bells? Like cats or criminals. Try walking around your neighbourhood with a jingle collar and see how fast the HOA sends a letter. So the next time someone tells you that medieval people were all pure and pious, just remember, they were running government-funded brothels while sermonising against temptation, and they were very, very good at making money off things they pretended not to like. You step outside just for a moment into the wet cobblestone street, and the air smacks you with the smell of horse dung and boiled cabbage. A cat darts across the alley, chased by a rat the size of a goblet. You turn your head, and there it is, the infamous district, the one that even the priests mutter about under their breath while pretending to quote scripture. This is Southwark, just across the Thames from the heart of London, and if you're looking for medieval England's most open secret, you've found it. Southwark was the place. A red-light district before the term even existed. The king's men, the clergy and peasants alike all knew what went on here. But the strange part, it wasn't technically under London's control. Southwark sat just outside the city walls, which meant it was governed by, you guessed it, the church, specifically the Bishop of Winchester. So while the bishop preached about chastity on Sunday, his office was collecting rent from brothels on Monday. The women who worked in Southwark's brothels weren't just prostitutes, they had a special title, Winchester geese. That's not slang, that's what they were officially called. Which, if you're thinking, wait, they named sex workers after birds? Yep. Exactly. It was a cruel joke and a way to dehumanise them. Goose was also slang for both disease and certain anatomical features. Bonus points for double entendre. These women weren't allowed to live inside the City of London proper, so Southwark became a self-contained zone of sin and survival. It had taverns, gambling houses, and dozens of brothels packed elbow to elbow like they were waiting to be condemned in alphabetical order. In fact, the stew houses, as they were called, were often built over bathhouses, hence the stew. Originally, they were just places to soak in a tub and maybe get a back rub, but we both know how that escalates. And once the curtains went up, no one was fooling anyone. But despite how regulated things were, the brothel workers in Southwark lived in a bizarre limbo. They had freedom, kind of. They could work, earn money, and sometimes even set their own terms. But they couldn't marry. They couldn't wear respectable colours like scarlet or blue, and they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Even in death they were reminded of who they were. There's a cemetery near the old brothel quarter, hidden under what's now a car park, that archaeologists have unearthed. They call it the Crossbones Graveyard. It was where the Winchester geese were buried, an unholy patch of dirt for the single women and other outcasts. No headstones, no records, just bones and whispers. And if that isn't bleakly poetic, I don't know what is. Back in the stew houses, the work was hard, repetitive, and dangerous. The women might take on 5, 10, even 15 clients in a day, many of them rough, some violent, and almost all of them carrying things no one could cure. They had to keep smiling, had to flatter, entertain, play the game. Because one bad night could mean being thrown into the street, no questions asked. There was always someone younger or prettier waiting to take your place. And the madams? They weren't always villains, but they were businesswomen first. They had to grease the palms of guards, pay off inspectors, and keep a delicate balance between profitability and disaster. A brothel that made too much noise, got too rowdy, or drew the attention of the wrong noble could be shut down overnight. Or worse, raided and burned by angry townsfolk pretending to be morally outraged. Which brings us to a lesser-known but endlessly strange fact. Brothel workers in Suffolk were technically under the bishop's protection. Like, legally. If someone assaulted one of them or tried to cheat her, she could bring a complaint, not to the city, but to the bishop's court. And sometimes she'd even win. Picture that. A prostitute walking into a religious courtroom, listing her grievances while a bishop adjusts his robe and pretends he doesn't know her by name. And here's something that continues to puzzle historians. Why did the church keep up the act? Why didn't they just shut it all down? There are theories, of course. Some say the church believed it was better to have sex work contained than scattered. Others say it was about money, always a good bet, and still others think the church just didn't want the political fallout. Shut the brothels and you'd suddenly have angry clients across all classes, including knights, including royal officials, including inconveniently other clergy. But the contradiction ran deep. Brothels like those in Suffolk operated in daylight, often with full knowledge of everyone involved. And yet, at the same time, they were coated in shame. You could visit one, joke about it with your friends, maybe even see your neighbour's husband leaving one, but you couldn't talk about it openly. It was the medieval version of don't. Ask, don't tell. With a lot more velvet and body lice. The women there weren't allowed to own property, couldn't testify in most courts, couldn't inherit, couldn't join guilds, but the economy couldn't function without them. Ports needed brothels, travelling merchants expected them, and armies, we'll get to that, relied on them for morale. The hypocrisy wasn't just a bug, it was the system. One more thing to make your blood pressure spike. Brothel workers in Southwark had to follow fashion laws that made them stand out on purpose. Some were forced to wear striped cloaks. Others weren't allowed to cover their hair. One law required them to wear shoes with the toes cut off. Yes, cut off. Like some ridiculous reverse Cinderella warning. These women don't belong at the ball. So next time you're in London, maybe walking near Borough Market or heading toward the Globe Theatre, just remember, beneath those cobblestones and hipster coffee shops lies a whole history of ghostly geese, medieval bathhouses and the strange half-legal world of regulated freedom. It's the part of London's past that no one wants to put on a postcard but still refuses to be forgotten. You sit quietly in the back corner of the common room as the last lantern sputters out and someone upstairs starts coughing again. The room is cold now, stripped of its earlier laughter and candlelit warmth, and the stone walls are once again just walls, not a stage for seduction but a container for the reality underneath. One of the women passes you, barefoot and blinking blearily in the gloom. You wonder who she is, how she got here, and how so many women, thousands across medieval Europe, ended up behind these velvet curtains in the first place. Let's start with the phrase, single woman, because that didn't always mean what you think it does. In many towns, single woman became a not-so-subtle code word for prostitute. You'd find it in tax records, court ledgers, even church rosters. If a woman wasn't married, wasn't part of a guild, and didn't have a male guardian listed beside her name, officials assumed, often without asking, that she was in the sex trade, and that assumption carried consequences. It meant fines, surveillance, and mandatory registration in many places. But why were so many women left in that position? The answer, of course, starts with poverty. In a society where women couldn't legally own land without a male relative, and where most jobs were closed to them unless they were nuns, laundresses, or bread bakers, the options were slim. The moment you lost your husband, your father, or your dowry, you were dangerously close to the edge, and sometimes the only way forward was through that crooked little alley that led to the brothel door. There were also orphans, hundreds of them, especially after plagues and wars swept through cities. Girls as young as 12 were taken in by brothel keepers with promises of food and shelter. There were no background checks, no training, no safety nets. One day you were helping in the kitchen of your aunt's inn. The next you were serving ale with a side of expectation and being told to smile, no matter how your stomach turned. Then there were the women sold into the trade. Families, especially poorer ones, would sometimes apprentice their daughters to madams in exchange for a lump sum. Officially, the arrangement was for domestic service. Unofficially, everyone knew what the work involved, and once you signed the parchment and handed over the girl, there was no refund. This brings us to one of the saddest ironies of medieval brothel life. Sometimes the brothel was the safest place a woman could be. Outside in the streets she risked being beaten, arrested or sexually assaulted with zero chance of justice. Inside she had a roof, regular meals, and at least some form of community. It wasn't a good life, but it was a less terrible one, which for many was the best offer on the table, and some women, rarely but still, chose the life. Not because they dreamed of it, but because it offered a bizarre kind of independence. They could earn their own money, they could live without a husband, they could make decisions. A few of them, especially in bigger cities, even managed to save enough to leave the trade, buy a tavern, or become a brothel keeper themselves. They weren't respected, but they had leverage, and in a world built to deny women any power at all, that meant something. There's a debated case from 14th century Ghent where a woman named Elsbeth the Weaver voluntarily registered as a sex worker, not because she was desperate, but because she was tired of being paid pennies for her textiles. She figured if she was going to be exploited anyway, she might as well be in charge of the terms. Scholars still argue whether that counts as empowerment or just a sharper form of despair. Probably both. And it wasn't just the cities. In smaller villages, sex work took a different form. Less official, less organised, but just as common. A woman might take in guests to support her family after her husband died in a farming accident. Or she might offer companionship to travelling clerics who conveniently forgot their vows. These arrangements weren't labelled, but they were understood, and they often came with less protection than even the roughest brothel in town. Then there were the travelling workers, women who moved from city to city, sometimes under the guise of being seamstresses or musicians, offering their services at fairs, markets or religious festivals. These were the clandestine sex workers, and they terrified authorities. Because unlike brothel-based workers, they weren't registered, weren't taxed, and couldn't be contained, which of course made them targets for harassment, arrest, or sudden disappearance. A quirky historical side note. In some cities, brothel workers had to carry tokens, badges, or ribbons that identified them as legal sex workers. These little markers served as both branding and control. No ribbon? You were breaking the law, but wearing the ribbon made you a walking target for every insult, grope, or street-level preacher with an opinion. It was the worst name tag ever invented. And still, despite everything, these women built small lives. They shared jokes in the dressing rooms. They watched each other's children. They learned tricks to keep clients from getting too rough or drunk. They had favourite songs, favourite perfumes, inside jokes, superstitions. Some of them scribbled poetry in the margins of old account books. Others kept pet birds in their windows, geese mostly, in a weird nod to their unofficial name. There are records of brothel women forming unofficial unions, banding together to protest a madam's abuse or demanding better pay from clients. These moments are fleeting in the archives, but they show something important. They weren't passive victims, they were survivors, sharp, stubborn, and often funny in the face of everything trying to crush them. But society didn't want to hear their voices. When they tried to leave the trade, they found doors slammed shut. Marriage? Only if the man was desperate. Honest work? Only if no one recognised them. Religious redemption? Maybe, if they cried hard enough and wore sackcloth for 5 years. And even then, someone would whisper behind their back, so here you are, still sitting in the quiet of the brothel, as the women begin to stir and stretch, and ready themselves for another day. You look around and the faces are different now, some younger, some older, all carrying the same weariness in their eyes. These are the single women of medieval Europe. Not saints, not sinners, just women who had no other choice, or who made a choice no one wanted to understand. The smell of frying onions wafts in from a nearby tavern, sharp and smoky in the morning haze. Someone singing off-key down the alley, and the sound of wooden shutters slamming open echoes between the damp stone walls. The brothel is waking up. But if you think the women here are running the show on their own, think again. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain not just on the workers, but on the people behind the brothels, the ones who pull strings, balance ledgers, grease palms, and sometimes wear way too much velvet for someone who doesn't actually work in a bed. Let's talk about madams, pimps, and the delicate balance of power that held medieval brothels together like sagging thatch on a rainy roof. First off, the idea of a lone woman running a brothel isn't just legend. It happened. Especially in cities where brothels were legally sanctioned, a madam could have an actual contract with the city, rent from the church, and a business license. Yes, a license. Picture a scroll with wax seals that says, in ornate calligraphy, "You may now operate your house of ill repute on Church Street, provided you collect your taxes quarterly and don't set anything on fire." These women weren't amateurs. They were business managers, security supervisors, customer service reps, and, let's be honest, occasional bouncers. They hired the workers, made sure no one stiffed them on payment, and paid city officials their bribes. I mean, regulatory fees. Some madams even had lawyers. Imagine that meeting. "Your Honour, my client merely offered companionship and fine ale. Any moaning was purely theological." In larger establishments, madams often wielded serious influence. They knew who visited, who paid, who begged for credit, who cried afterward. That information was worth a lot. There are records of brothel owners selling gossip to city officials or threatening to reveal a noble's preferences if rent negotiations didn't go their way. If you're picturing a blackmail-powered Game of Thrones with fewer swords and more satin, yep, you're getting it. Now, not every madam had power. Some were just older workers who aged out of the trade and took on management because it was safer and slightly less exhausting. Others were barely scraping by, constantly dodging debt collectors and city fines. But the myth of the cruel, corset-wielding brothel tyrant, it's only half true. Many madams had to walk a tightrope every day, protect their workers just enough to keep things running, but not so much that they got accused of running a disorderly house. Because guess what? Disorder was bad for taxes, and then there were the pimps. Not all brothels had them, especially not the state-sanctioned ones. But where they did exist, their role was grim and simple: control. Pimps, usually men, weren't businessmen so much as enforcers. They kept workers in line with threats or violence. They extracted a cut from every transaction. And in cities where prostitution was illegal or underground, they often functioned as bodyguards and jailers rolled into one. The best you could hope for was one who kept you fed and didn't leave bruises. There are chilling records from 14th century Barcelona where women testified, under guard in court, against pimps who branded them, locked them in rooms, or sold them from one brothel to another. Some pimps ran brothels disguised as boarding houses with signs out front advertising laundry services or fortunes told. The authorities usually looked the other way, unless someone important got involved, which of course they often did. Here's where things get blurry. In some cities, men who ran brothels claimed they were protectors, not pimps. They argued they were just landlords offering security services. Never mind that their tenants weren't allowed to leave. This legal dodgeball went on for centuries and still confuses historians today. Was he a pimp, a manager, a landlord, or just a guy who liked hanging around a lot of open windows? No one can agree. But what they all agree on is this: brothel power structures were messy. They depended on fear, necessity, manipulation, and just enough kindness to keep people from running. Some madams ruled with iron fists and strict schedules. Others were more like mothers, tough, weary, and endlessly practical. They sewed torn dresses, taught younger women how to negotiate, and occasionally read fortunes when business was slow. There's a quirky historical moment from 15th century Prague where a brothel was run by a blind woman named Katka. She couldn't see her clients or her workers, but she had such a sharp ear for voices that she reportedly ran the house better than any sighted rival. She remembered every customer's preferences, debts, and gossip, and was rumoured to spot a fake coin just by touch. Scholars debate whether her story is myth or reality, but either way it tells you what mattered. Not beauty or brawn, but control. Because that's what madams and pimps had. Control over space, bodies, and, most dangerously, information. They knew things, knew how city politics worked, knew how to keep secrets, or how to sell them. In a world where priests and judges visited brothels as often as taverns, that knowledge was gold, or at least good for an extended lease. Of course, sometimes the power turned. When a madam grew too wealthy, too visible, or too opinionated, she could be dragged down fast. All it took was one bishop with a grudge, or one jealous husband with a dagger. Brothels were tolerated, but never truly safe, and the people who ran them walked a line thinner than a wine-soaked stocking. And let's not forget the clients in all this, because part of the madam's job was managing them too, making sure they paid, making sure they didn't get violent, making sure they didn't die in the middle of anything inconvenient. You laugh, but there's an infamous case from Paris where a nobleman actually expired mid-encounter, and the madam had to quietly roll him out the back door before the city watch arrived. The brothel was fined. The woman involved was blamed for unholy vigour. The dead man got a Christian burial. Medieval justice, ladies and gentlemen. So next time you picture a medieval brothel, don't imagine it as a free-for-all of sin and giggles. Think spreadsheets. Think bribery. Think tense negotiations over rent and velvet curtain cleaning fees. Think politics with perfume. And maybe raise an eyebrow at the idea that these women, and the people who managed them, were somehow unimportant. Because behind every knight's swagger and monk's sermon, there was often a brothel ledger, carefully balanced and quietly humming in the background. The sun's climbing higher now, pale and watery through a veil of soot and fog, and the streets around the brothel are getting busy. Merchants shout over wheels creaking across stones. Fishmongers display yesterday's catch like it's fresh. Church bells clang to remind you of your sins, and above it all the brothel's windows creak open one by one, airing out the stale air of a long night. If you look closely, you'll spot something peculiar. Velvet drapes, bright ribbons, and a few lingering gentlemen adjusting their boots before slinking off. But what you don't see, the part hidden behind that facade, is the math, the logistics, the hard, grimy business of sex. Let's talk about the rates, the rooms, and the sheer reality of what was bought, what it cost, and why none of it smelled like roses. First up, prices. A night with a brothel worker in medieval Europe wasn't exactly cheap, unless you were in a hurry, in which case there were express options. The rate depended on your social class, the brothel status, and the time of day. In a top-tier London stew house, a full session with food and a bath might cost a silver groat or more. But in the seedier quarters of Prague or Marseille, you could bargain down to a handful of copper coins, maybe even pay in goods, like wool, salt, or, tragically, a really nice onion. Brothel menus, yes, actual menus, listed services and prices. Some were painted on the walls, others were written in crude rhyme and sung by children outside to draw in customers, because medieval life was nothing if not horrifyingly casual about things. For example, in 15th century Augsburg, a recorded price list offers a toss in the hay for the cost of one loaf of bread and a shot of schnapps. That's not romantic, that's just carbs and coping. Now let's talk about what that payment bought. There were levels. If you paid more, you got more privacy, better wine, and maybe even silk sheets. Though silk might mean the least stained sheet we have left. For lower-paying clients, it was usually a rough mattress on the floor or a shared bench with a moth-eaten cushion. No privacy, no comfort, just a candle melting too close to someone's elbow, and a madam tapping her foot outside the door, watching the hourglass. And the rooms? Don't let Hollywood fool you. These weren't candlelit love dens draped in rose petals. Most brothel rooms were damp, draughty, and filled with whatever furniture hadn't been stolen or broken. You'd find straw mattresses crawling with lice, threadbare curtains barely hanging on, and chamber pots that hadn't been emptied since the Feast of St. Blasius. If the bed wasn't broken already, it probably would be by morning, either from use or from some drunk tripping over it on the way to pee in a corner. Lighting was inconsistent. Candles were expensive, so many brothels relied on the small round windows cut high into the walls, called hag holes, to let in daylight. That meant no privacy from peeping neighbours or the occasional goose that wandered in. Some rooms didn't even have doors, just heavy woolen drapes, and the sounds. Let's just say you got used to hearing things you couldn't unhear. Now, let's address the hygiene situation, which was not great. Brothels, even the fancy ones, weren't exactly sanitary. Sheets were rarely washed. Water was reused in baths until it resembled soup. Workers did their best. They used herbs, vinegar rinses, and perfumes to mask odours. But there's only so much lavender can do when you've got 20 men a night and no running water. There are records from Lübeck and Vienna where brothel regulations actually required workers to bathe once a week. Once a week. That was considered progressive. They also mandated the use of clean linens and banned filthy straw, which raises a grim question. What exactly was filthy enough to be banned if all straw was basically shared with rats? Tooth care was equally minimal. People chewed parsley or fennel to freshen breath. A few brothel workers even rubbed crushed sage on their teeth or carried clove buds in their pockets. But when half your clients were missing teeth anyway, the bar wasn't exactly high. And let's not pretend the brothel experience was a spa day for the workers. Most of them dealt with injuries, bruises, scratches, worse, and there was little time to rest. You finished one client, wiped down with a wet cloth, maybe splashed your face with cold wine, and braced yourself for the next. No downtime, no sick leave, and if you refused too many customers, the madam might dock your pay or threaten to kick you out. Speaking of pay, most workers didn't get to keep much of what they earned. A hefty cut went to the madam, another to the city, via taxes, and sometimes a portion to guards or pimps for protection. That meant that for every silver coin earned, the worker might only keep a sliver. Enough for food, a bit of soap, and maybe a cheap ribbon from the market. And in case you're wondering, yes, medieval brothels had theft problems. Workers were robbed by clients. Clients were robbed by other clients. There are hilarious and sad court records of men complaining their boots were stolen mid-coitus, or waking up to find their purses gone. One man in Bruges even claimed his entire belt pouch and pants had vanished. The brothel madam insisted he donated them willingly. We'll call that a draw. Here's a quirky fringe fact. In some brothels, workers wore bells on their ankles, not just to advertise themselves, but to keep time. A certain number of rings per session, then the client had to pay again or leave. Like an old-timey version of a parking meter that jingled with every movement. Romantic, right? Historians still debate just how standardised this all was. Some say the brothel economy was shockingly organised, like mini-hotels with check-in hours, menus, and even loyalty perks. Others argue it was mostly chaos, held together by tradition and desperation. Truth is, it varied city by city, house by house. But what's clear is that nothing about the work was easy, glamorous, or remotely fair. So next time you walk past a posh velvet curtain in a modern hotel, remember the legacy behind it. The scratched floorboards, the creaky mattress, the broken latch, and the generations of women who learned to count coins by candlelight, stitched their own chemises between shifts, and tried, somehow, to keep a sliver of themselves safe behind the math of survival. It's late afternoon now, and the alley's a little less frantic. Shadows stretch across puddles, and the smell of roasting meat wafts in from a street cart you don't entirely trust. In the brothel, the workers are preparing for the next wave. Fresh linens laid out, or at least turned over. Bodices tightened, rouge dabbed on cheeks that have already seen too many customers today. It's almost time for the evening crowd, and with it comes a particular breed of customer. The medieval man, armed with coin, codpiece, and enough questionable hygiene to make your nose consider early retirement. Let's talk about the clientele. Who actually showed up to brothels? Short answer, everyone. Longer answer, merchants, knights, students, monks, fishmongers, stable hands, nobles in disguise, and the occasional overworked scribe looking for an evening that didn't involve parchment. Brothels were the great equalizers of medieval society. You could find a peasant and a noble under the same roof, sometimes even in the same bed, though probably not by choice. These men came in with expectations, fantasies of beauty, obedience, and a warm body that somehow knew exactly what they wanted before they said a word. What they got, more often than not, was a tired woman doing her best to stay awake, pretending not to notice the clink of coins being counted under the sheets. But the clients didn't care. To them this was an escape, an evening of release, where they didn't have to follow rules or answer to wives or clergy. It was a rare space where their desires were not only allowed, but expected. The behaviours ranged from awkward to horrifying. Some men were gentle, shy even, fumbling through the encounter like they were terrified of touching another human being. Others treated workers like furniture, issuing orders and threats, convinced their coin bought total control. And some didn't even come for sex. They came to talk, to cry, to drink, to be held, to have someone ask, "How was your day?" even if the answer was mumbled through wine-stained lips. There are records from Italian brothels where certain workers became popular simply because they were good listeners. Men lined up to tell them their troubles, about debts, feuds, marriage problems, or nightmares from the battlefield. These were sessions of tenderness masquerading as lust, and they left the women emotionally drained in a way physical labour never could. Still, sex was the main transaction, and it wasn't always straightforward. There were clients who had requests, positions copied from forbidden books, fantasies inspired by saints' paintings, don't ask, and elaborate scenarios that involved props, costumes, or questionable Latin phrases. Some workers played along, others rolled their eyes and went with it. You don't exactly get training for this kind of job. You just learn by doing and hope the props don't break mid-session. One of the more curious facts. The fear of disease was real, even for men who didn't fear much else. Medieval clients often arrived carrying herbal charms, St. Benedict medals, or bundles of rue to ward off illness. Some would drink potions before visiting, thinking it made them immune to the risks of sex. Others applied concoctions to their genitals, some of which included ingredients like garlic, lead powder, or mercury paste. Side effects included pain, boils, and death. But hey, anything to keep the groin demons away. Despite the risks, the fear wasn't enough to keep them away, and most didn't practice anything close to what we'd call safe sex. Condoms, if you could even call them that, were rudimentary, made of linen soaked in vinegar or oiled sheep gut. They were expensive, uncomfortable, and rarely used unless a client was especially paranoid or unusually well read. Mostly, protection came down to prayer and denial. And speaking of sheep gut, here's a fringe detail for your nightmares. Some brothel workers developed their own protective techniques, including using sponges, wads of wool, or even specially carved wooden plugs. They didn't have much science to go on, but they had a lot of motivation to not die from someone else's bad decisions. There's also an open debate among scholars about how much clients truly understood the risks. Some argue that knowledge of disease, especially syphilis, was widespread by the late Middle Ages, and men just didn't care. Others suggest that people blamed symptoms on curses, bad air, or punishment from God, not physical transmission. The truth is probably in the middle. Most clients didn't know the specifics, but they knew something was dangerous. They just figured it wouldn't happen to them. Class played a role in how clients behaved too. Nobles could pay for more privacy, better wine, and more discreet arrangements. Some brothels even had secret entrances for wealthy men who didn't want to be seen by neighbours, or, worse, their wives. There were nobles who kept long-term arrangements with a single brothel worker, essentially turning her into a mistress with a house, stipend, and exclusive rights. Others treated brothels like taverns, strolling in, demanding attention, and throwing money around to prove they were important. And then there were the university students. Oh yes, young, loud, badly shaved, and convinced they were philosophers. They flooded brothels near colleges, often in groups, drunk off cheap wine and eager to quote Aristotle while untying their boots. In Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, records show brothel disturbances caused by scholars who refused to pay, tried to steal curtains, or challenged other clients to duels over everything. If anyone deserved to be banned, it was them. But their parents had money, so they were always welcomed back. Despite the chaos, most brothels tried to maintain some form of order. Clients who got violent might be banned, or at least charged extra for the damages. Drunkards could be tossed out into the street by guards, or if the brothel was connected to city officials, taken to the stocks. Some madams even kept client blacklists, though enforcing them was difficult when coin was short. It's easy to imagine the clients as villains, and often they were. But like everyone in this system, they were also trapped. Trapped in social roles, marriages without affection, rigid expectations of masculinity, and a culture that taught them desire was dirty but unavoidable. Some were cruel, others were just lost. So when you picture that brothel window creaking open at dusk and the first customer stepping in, cloak drawn, hat low, eyes darting, know this: he's not just buying sex, he's buying escape. From poverty, powerlessness, piety, or pain. He's bringing in his shame and secrets, and he's hoping they'll disappear behind the curtain. They won't. But for a few silver coins, he'll pretend they do. The light fades faster now, casting long, sharp shadows down the alleyways as the city eases into night. Inside the brothel, candles are lit, the scent of beeswax mingling with stale wine and perfume trying too hard. There's a nervous energy in the air tonight, like everyone's waiting for something, or someone to go wrong. And it's not paranoia. It's a deep, familiar hum of dread that creeps under the skin of every worker in the house. Because if there's one thing scarier than a drunk noble, it's disease. And if you're a medieval brothel worker, it's not just illness. It's stigma, exile, and sometimes death. Tonight we're diving headfirst into one of the most horrifying corners of this world. The health systems, if you can call them that, designed to manage the chaos of sexually transmitted diseases. We're talking about regulation, suspicion, herbal guesswork, and leeches. Lots of leeches. First, the basics. Medieval medicine didn't understand germs. People thought diseases came from bad humours in the body or from miasmas, foul-smelling air. You didn't catch a disease from someone else. You caught it from the air they had corrupted with sin, lust, or maybe just garlic breath. This misunderstanding meant that even when the spread of diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea became obvious, no one knew exactly how it was happening, but they knew where, and fingers pointed, fast and hard, at brothels. By the late 14th century, cities like Florence, Nuremberg and London had started to create laws aimed at containing venereal disease, not by treating it, not by helping the women. No, the idea was to control them. Health inspectors were introduced, usually men, usually unqualified, to conduct weekly visits to brothels and check workers for visible signs of infection. Swollen sores, strange rashes, too pale or too flushed. You might be sent to the town hospital or locked up in a leper house until someone decided what to do with you. Spoiler, that decision rarely favoured the patient. Imagine standing half naked in front of a city clerk who's never treated anything more complex than a broken toe, while he squints at your body and announces your future. It wasn't medicine, it was theatre. Cruel, uncomfortable theatre with terrible lighting and no dignity. And don't think for a second these inspections were done privately. There are records of women being examined in front of male officials, apprentices, and even curious local youths who wanted to learn about disease. If you felt shame, that was your fault. If you screamed, someone made a joke. If you protested, you were fined. But wait, it gets worse. If you were found to be infected, even without symptoms, your belongings could be seized. You might be quarantined in a pest house, which was less hospital and more rotting barn full of despair. You wouldn't be allowed visitors, wouldn't be paid and wouldn't be trusted again, even if you recovered. In some towns, like Cologne, you'd be branded with a hot iron. A literal mark, just to let everyone know that you had once been unclean. No antibiotics, no privacy, no compassion, just superstition and punishment wrapped in a robe of sanctimony. Here's a fringe detail for your inner historian. One brothel in Lübeck actually published its own guidelines for cleanliness, including the use of vinegar-soaked cloths between clients, mandatory foot washing, and designated linens. The madam who enforced these rules was rumoured to have a better survival rate than the city infirmary. Of course, she was later accused of witchcraft because apparently basic hygiene was suspicious. And yes, there were attempts to treat STDs, with herbs, potions, bleeding, and the occasional horrifying ointment made from animal fat, sulphur, and something referred to ominously as blue mineral. One popular remedy for syphilis involved mercury, rubbed into the skin or ingested in small amounts. It caused hallucinations, organ damage, and sometimes a spectacular death by internal liquefaction. But for a while, it was the gold standard. Imagine having an itchy rash and being told to drink a heavy metal. Medieval medicine, fixing problems with worse problems since 500 AD. There's an ongoing debate among scholars about when syphilis actually arrived in Europe. Some claim it was imported from the Americas after Columbus's voyages, making its first terrifying appearance around 1495. Others argue it existed in a different form long before that, just misdiagnosed or hidden behind euphemisms like the French disease, the Neapolitan affliction, or, my personal favourite, the burning joy. The truth is blurry, as usual. Records are vague, symptoms were inconsistent, and nobody really wanted to write down that they died crotch first. What's not debated is how the blame fell, hard, on brothel workers. They were the first accused, the first punished, and the last helped. Even when it was clear that clients were spreading disease from house to house, like horny little vectors, the women bore the burden of shame. Some cities even passed laws stating that any brothel worker with visible signs of illness had to wear a bell in public. Like they were dangerous animals, or ghosts, or both. This stigma spread fast. Landlords refused to rent to brothel workers. Markets banned them from buying produce. Healers sometimes turned them away, claiming they were too sinful to be saved. And while male clients were occasionally mentioned in city health records, they were rarely punished. One Vienna court case from the early 1500s documents a nobleman who passed a burning affliction to 14 women in 1 month. His punishment? A fine. Her punishment? Eviction, branding, and exile. And let's not pretend these policies worked. Disease still raged through cities, spreading like wildfire through brothels, taverns, and private homes. If anything, the fear of punishment made people more secretive. Workers hid their symptoms, madams paid off inspectors, and clients lied about their health. But the cycle continued. Deny, disguise, decay. Despite all this, brothel workers developed their own strategies. They used herbal poultices made of yarrow and marigold. They shared information, what rashes to watch for, what fevers came next, what herbs reduced pain. Some even practiced forms of rudimentary condom use, or timed their sick days to avoid dangerous clients. It wasn't perfect, but it was knowledge passed woman to woman, beneath the radar of the very officials who claimed to be protecting them. And in the midst of this chaos, the brothel endured. Because there was money to be made. Because the demand never stopped. Because despite the fear and the scars and the slow march of disease, the system kept turning, and the women inside had no choice but to turn with it. The bells chime vespers in the distance, echoing across the rooftops like some divine reminder that the day is winding down, and that you probably haven't confessed your sins in a while. But here in the brothel, those bells barely register. The women keep working, the madam keeps counting. And just beyond the thick wooden door, a familiar silhouette steps into the candlelight. Robes, hood, sandals, a small well-worn satchel with something suspiciously like a flask tucked inside. That's right, it's a clergyman. Again. If you think medieval priests, monks and friars kept to their vows like saints on parade, well, that's cute. But no, the historical record is riddled with stories of clergy frequenting brothels, sometimes as customers, sometimes as landlords, and occasionally as both. So tonight, let's talk about the extremely uncomfortable marriage of piety and pleasure. Because what happened when the men of God wanted a little taste of sin? They didn't pray it away, they paid. The hypocrisy is staggering but not surprising. The church preached chastity, condemned lust, and claimed the moral high ground on all things carnal, but it also existed within a world that ran on very human appetites, and brothels, despite being officially frowned upon, were often located disturbingly close to monasteries, convents, and cathedrals. Coincidence? Sure. And I have a plague cure made of wet moss to sell you. Some clergymen came in disguise, others didn't even bother. In Avignon, where the papal court had its temporary headquarters, the city's brothel district was notorious for welcoming priests. There are letters from bishops complaining about monks dragging women into their cloisters, not metaphorically, literally. The line between sacred space and rented mattress was, at best, porous. A notorious example comes from 14th century London, where an Augustinian friar was caught in a brothel during Lent, claiming, get this, that he was there to offer confession to the fallen. He was reportedly naked at the time. When asked about this discrepancy, he insisted the woman he was visiting was in great need of spiritual relief. Interpret that as you will. But it wasn't always secret. In some cases, the church directly benefited from prostitution. The Bishop of Winchester, as we've mentioned, owned much of the Suffolk district and collected rents from the brothels there. These weren't one-off arrangements. They were formal, contractual, and very lucrative. Some brothels even paid a yearly fee to the local parish to remain in good standing. An ironic phrase, if there ever was one. This contradiction, moral condemnation on paper, indulgence in practice, has baffled historians for centuries. Was it institutional blindness? Cultural convenience? A case of do as I say, not as I do on a divine scale? The answer seems to be yes to all of the above. And clergy weren't just clients. In some towns they were silent partners. A monk might inherit property from a dying relative and lease it out as a brothel. A priest might collect rent from a building that happens to house 12 women and a large number of unclaimed shoes. One account from 15th century Cologne describes a priest who rented an upper floor to a madam, then charged extra for using his private backstair. Entrepreneurial spirit? Blasphemy? Again, yes. But this wasn't without risk. Church laws technically prohibited fornication by clergy. If caught, the consequences range from penance and fines to excommunication. But in reality, most were quietly moved to another parish, or told to pray harder, or, in the worst cases, promoted if their sins weren't too public. After all, losing a good tithing priest over a few evening indulgences just didn't make sense for business. Still, scandals erupted. In Florence, a Dominican friar was accused of fathering 6 children with a brothel worker he visited weekly. When questioned, he claimed she was a blessed temptress sent to test him. That argument didn't hold up in court, but it did earn him a footnote in several heresy trials. And let's not forget the whispers about Pope Alexander VI, whose appetite for pleasure became so notorious that some reformers wanted to shut down all brothels just to stop him from showing up. There's a fringe but fascinating tradition in medieval Spain where certain monasteries kept penitent houses, supposed safe spaces for women leaving prostitution. These were, in theory, charitable institutions. In practice, many doubled as places where clergy kept their own concubines under the banner of spiritual rehabilitation. The paperwork said salvation. The bed linen said otherwise. Meanwhile, sermons against prostitution continued. Priests stood in pulpits, condemning the very sins they'd committed hours earlier. And the public? They knew. Everyone knew. But as long as the clergy performed the sacraments, kept the churches open, and didn't get caught with their trousers actually down mid-mass, people looked the other way. A soul needed saving after all, and the line to heaven was long enough without making enemies out of your confessor. And the women? They played along. Some feigned innocence. Others leaned into it, offering blessings with each visit, calling their clients father, with a wink that could curdle wine. For some, clergy made for safer customers, wealthier, less violent, more predictable. For others, they were just another hypocrisy to endure. A man in robes was no different from a man in armour when he climbed the stairs. There's an open scholarly debate about how much the church really knew about all this. Some argue that bishops turned a blind eye only when it suited them. Others suggest the church's moral framework was so flexible that its leaders genuinely believed they could sin in the flesh while remaining holy in spirit. A sort of divine loophole. It's hard to say. But the receipts don't lie, and those receipts were often signed in wax by someone who also offered last rites. By the end of the night, the clergyman you noticed earlier leaves quietly, face hidden beneath his hood, coin pouch a little lighter. He doesn't look back. He probably has prayers to lead at sunrise, maybe a sermon to write, one that starts with, "Beware the temptations of the flesh," delivered with full conviction and just the faintest scent of rose oil still clinging to his sleeves. The fire crackles low in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows that dance up the cracked stone walls like ghosts trying to reenact old mistakes. The air's heavy with incense and sweat, and there's a book, yes, a real book, resting open on a corner table. Not a Bible, not a ledger. This one's different. Its pages are worn, its ink faint, and its drawings, well, let's just say they're not exactly suitable for a Sunday sermon. Tonight, we're stepping into the hidden shelves and secret drawers of the medieval brothel to explore a world of erotic manuals, aphrodisiacs, superstitions, and deeply questionable medieval sex science. Because believe it or not, brothels weren't just about doing, they were about learning, about teaching even, and not in a classroom way. More like whispered tips, drawings passed between friends, potions boiled in a back room, and the occasional sketch that looked suspiciously like 2 goats but was meant to be instructional. Welcome to the strange, awkward, and sometimes hilariously inaccurate sex ed of the Middle Ages. Let's start with the forbidden books. Most were handwritten. passed secretly from hand to hand, often in Latin or the local vernacular but buried beneath euphemism. These weren't just crude doodles for fun, though, trust me, some absolutely were. They were attempts to explain sex, to map out positions, techniques and ideas of pleasure, in a time when even saying ankle too loudly could cause a scandal. One of the more infamous examples was a manuscript known by modern scholars as the Speculum Alfoderi, roughly translated, The Mirror of Copulation. A charming title, truly. It included illustrated sexual positions, some practical, some bordering on acrobatics, and commentary that tried with mixed success to combine pleasure with piety. The book advised men to avoid becoming beasts in their lust, while showing them exactly how to become very creative beasts indeed. And yes, brothels had copies. Not all, but some, especially the better-funded ones with more literate madams. These books were used for training, for inspiration, and occasionally just for a laugh. Some workers memorised a few moves to please more particular clients. Others made up new ones on the spot and joked about naming them after saints. Because why not bring St. Ambrose into this? He'd love that. Alongside the manuals were love potions and aphrodisiacs, sold under the counter or brewed by local herbalists with very flexible ethics. Most were made from herbs like damiana, fennel, mustard seed and nettle. Some included ground animal parts, deer testicles for instance, or exotic spices like saffron and cinnamon, which were believed to heat the blood. The logic was, if it made you sweat, it must awaken your desire. Science? Did they work? Sort of. Maybe. Occasionally. Honestly, most of them probably just gave you a rash or made you vomit. But the placebo effect is powerful, and in a world where sex was wrapped in fear and shame, a little liquid courage, whether it worked or not, felt like magic, and there was actual magic too. Superstition ran deep, especially around sex. Brothel workers tied herbs above the door to ward off evil spirits. They wore talismans to protect against infertility or infection. Some whispered incantations before each encounter, asking for luck, strength, or, in particularly desperate times, invisibility. Can't hurt to ask. One of the strangest practices involved beans. Yes, beans. Carried in a pouch or tucked into a corset as a kind of charm. Black beans for protection, red beans for passion, white beans for, well, no one's really sure. The origins of the practice are murky, but records from French and Spanish brothels show women listing magic beans in their personal inventories. Maybe they worked. Maybe they just felt like something they could control in a world that took everything else. There were also songs, saucy little verses that doubled as mnemonic devices for technique. Think limericks about how to position your legs or where to put your hands. They were passed along from older workers to younger ones, often edited and localised. One English brothel had a chant that went, "Bend the knee for the bishop's eye, but keep the coin for he lifts the thigh." Catchy, right? It's medieval sexual wisdom disguised as tavern poetry. Now let's not pretend this was all fun and educational. These tools of the trade were also tools of survival. Brothel workers used erotic knowledge to stand out, to keep clients interested, to avoid punishment for being boring or unskilled. In a job where refusing a customer could mean the difference between dinner and starvation, knowing one more trick might keep you in good graces for another week. And let's be honest, some clients expected expertise. They came in demanding the special treatment they'd heard about from a friend, or seen scribbled in a monk's margin notes. Show me the trick from the Venetian girl. Do the thing with your ankle and the candle. It was theatre, a routine, and the workers were actors, directors, and stagehands all at once. This brings us to a scholarly debate that still circles like a pigeon at a city square. How much of this erotic knowledge was actually empowering? Were these women reclaiming some agency through technique and knowledge? Or were they simply adapting to survive under impossible conditions? The answer predictably is both. You can be a victim of a system and still become brilliant at navigating it. And sometimes that brilliance looked like a hastily drawn diagram of something that might qualify as illegal in at least 3 kingdoms. There are also reports, rare but telling, of brothel workers refusing certain acts. Too dangerous, they'd say, or not decent. And yes, there was a hierarchy even among sin. Certain positions were seen as wifely, others as disgraceful, and some as just not worth the backache. Workers had their boundaries, and while those weren't always respected, they were real. and enforced with sarcasm, negotiation, or in some cases a well-aimed boot. So tonight, as the brothel hums back to life, with wine flowing and windows glowing, picture that little book on the table. Picture the herbs hanging in the corner. Picture a woman laughing as she folds a cloth into a shape meant to teach an apprentice something that probably shouldn't be taught with a napkin. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, but it was clever, and for many it was the closest thing to power they had. It's deep into the night now, the hour when the fire has burned down to lazy red embers, and the streets outside the brothel are still. Too still. The drunks have passed out, the last of the customers have stumbled home or curled into borrowed corners upstairs, and downstairs in the kitchen, a woman scrubs the same cup she's already cleaned 5 times. Everyone's waiting for dawn, but inside one of the rooms, behind a velvet curtain that doesn't quite reach the floor, something darker has played out, something you won't find listed on the brothel menu or whispered about with the usual jokes. Because this next part, it's not funny. It's about obsession, purity, and the brutal price paid by anyone born into the myth of the virgin. Let's talk about the very real, very medieval, very horrifying obsession with virginity. If you think modern ideas about purity are weirdly intense, medieval Europe said, "Hold my wine-stained manuscript." Virginity wasn't just a preference, it was an ideal, a commodity, a symbol of status, virtue, and mystic holiness, all wrapped in one terrifying concept that could make or break a woman's life before she'd even spoken a full sentence. This obsession reached deep into the brothel. You'd think, logically, a brothel wouldn't concern itself with something as contradictory as virginity. But oh, it did. Because clients wanted it. Badly. And they were willing to pay absurd amounts for it. Some paid enough to keep a woman fed for months. Others offered land, horses, even political favours, just for the illusion of deflowering a pure girl. And here's the bleak twist. Brothels provided. They offered virgins to high-paying clients. Whether or not the girl actually was one, it didn't matter. The performance mattered. Blood-stained sheets were faked. Shy behaviour was rehearsed. Sometimes chicken blood was used. Other times the woman bit her own lip hard enough to bleed. It was theatre again, but this time the stakes were violence. In some cases girls were actually virgins, sold into the brothel or taken in under false promises. These were often orphans, teenagers, or desperate daughters from impoverished families. Their first client wasn't a gentle welcome into womanhood. It was an act of brutal transaction. There are records too many to ignore of girls as young as 12 being offered to clients under the guise of purity. Some brothels even advertised it, coded but clear. A new flower in bloom. Unopened treasure. You didn't have to read between the lines, it was all right there, sickeningly poetic. There's one account from 15th century Lyon where a nobleman paid a small fortune for the untouched one, only to return 2 nights later demanding another. The girl in question, dead. Internal injuries. No investigation, no charges. The brothel simply replaced her. So yes, this obsession came with blood, sometimes staged, often not. And it was rooted in the belief that virginity was a form of spiritual currency, a holy state. Something sacred that, once lost, rendered a woman permanently changed, lesser. This wasn't just religious fluff, it was encoded into laws. In some cities, a woman's virginity determined her dowry, her legal worth, her chance at protection under the law. Which is to say, once it was gone, the world treated her as disposable. And yet, paradoxically, virginity was eroticized like mad. Men wanted it, priests preached about it, artists painted it, poets compared it to snow, lilies, glass, and all sorts of other fragile things that don't handle pressure well. And the women? They were caught in the middle, expected to remain pure in a world where poverty, coercion and survival made that almost impossible. Even within the brothel, hierarchy played out along this line. Younger girls, especially those perceived to be virgins, could demand higher prices. Older women were pushed to take more clients for less pay, and once you'd lost that first-time value, whether truly or just in perception, you slipped down the ladder fast. There's a fringe belief that some brothel workers tried to restore their virginity using herbal poultices or mechanical tricks. One recipe from Venice included egg whites, crushed rose petals and goat's milk, applied with fingers crossed and a lot of wishful thinking. It didn't work, obviously, but the hope behind it, that maybe you could go back, reset the clock, be seen as valuable again, is heartbreaking. Meanwhile, some clients weren't just obsessed with purity, they were obsessed with violating it. There's a darkness here that no candlelight can soften. For certain men, especially those in power, the act of taking virginity wasn't about sex at all. It was about domination, a show of control, the idea that they could purchase what others revered. There are accounts of kings sending trusted men to locate virgins for their entertainment. These weren't romantic trysts. They were calculated, often violent and entirely one-sided. And if the woman resisted, that wasn't seen as a red flag. It was part of the performance. A reluctant virgin was more prized than a willing one. The line between roleplay and real harm dissolved, and in many cases no one cared to redraw it. The myth of the pure, unwilling girl being won over by force wasn't just a story, it was sold, nightly, behind curtained doors. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these brothel virginities were more illusion than reality. Some historians argue that the whole economy of first-time sex was staged, choreographed with props and actors like a terrible pageant. Others insist that many of these girls were genuinely untouched before their brothel debuts, and that the damage, physical and emotional, was real and rampant. The truth, as always, likely floats in between. Real pain wrapped in pretend innocence. But what's undeniable is this. The fetishization of virginity was never about women. It was about men's fantasies, their control, their need to mark, own and degrade something they'd decided had value only in its untouched state. And when that value was gone, the woman was cast off, replaced, or expected to simply smile and carry on like it hadn't mattered. So now, as the city sleeps and the brothel winds down, think of the beds upstairs. Think of the girls brought in with promises of work, only to discover that their worth lay in what they hadn't done yet. Think of the linen sheets stained more by performance than passion. Think of the myth that purity equals value, and how deeply it cut into the lives of women who had so little to begin with. And then think of the silence that followed, how no one talked about it the next morning, how the coin still changed hands, how the world kept turning. The grey light of morning creeps in again, painting the floorboards with streaks of ash and lemon. The brothel is quiet, eerily so. Upstairs, someone coughs behind a closed door. Downstairs, a broom drags half-heartedly across last night's footprints, and in the back room, one of the girls is sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, not crying exactly, but not blinking either. There's something hollow behind her eyes that wasn't there yesterday. You've seen it before, you'll see it again. Because for all the chaos, commerce and ritualised sin of medieval brothel life, there was another undercurrent running quietly and violently beneath it all. The threat and sometimes the presence of queerness. Tonight we're going underground, into the secret networks, whispered names and barely visible gestures that made up the hidden world of queer intimacy in medieval brothels. Because yes, it happened. Same-sex desire, gender non-conforming identities, and all the messy, beautiful, terrifying expressions that didn't fit into the clean boxes of man and woman, client and worker, husband and wife. These stories rarely made it into the history books, but they're there, between the lines, in the court records, in the margins, and in brothels. Sometimes they hid in plain sight. Let's start with the women. Not every relationship in a brothel was about male clients and female workers. The women lived together, worked side by side, shared beds to save warmth, and built deep, complicated bonds. Some of them romantic, many of them sexual. This wasn't just survival. It was affection, desire, love, even. There are letters, scattered, rare, precious, between brothel workers that speak of longing and jealousy, promises and secrets. "You smelled of rosemary," one woman wrote to another in Avignon. "My mouth still remembers the shape of your name." That's not business. That's something deeper. And sometimes these relationships were strategic. In a world where men came and went, where violence was always a risk, women found comfort and protection in each other. They formed what some historians call emotional households, not marriages in the legal sense, but real partnerships nonetheless. They shared coin, food, childcare. They watched each other's backs, literally and figuratively. And yes, they shared bodies. When the door closed and the candles dimmed, no one was watching. Of course, it was dangerous. If discovered, queer women risked more than ridicule. They could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Female same-sex acts weren't always prosecuted the way male ones were, largely because male authorities had no idea how to define them. But when they were noticed, the reaction was swift and vicious. The idea that women could find pleasure without men was threatening, an affront to the entire patriarchal system. Because if a woman didn't need a man, what use was she? Where did she fit? Still, some brothels tolerated, or even quietly accepted these relationships, as long as they didn't interfere with business. There are accounts of madams turning a blind eye to what the girls did between clients, as long as the coin kept flowing. One brothel in Frankfurt was rumoured to have a mirror room, where two women would entertain a male client not by touching him, but by performing with each other. A crude, exploitative version of queerness, but a version nonetheless. And sometimes, between the performance, real desire sparked. Then there were the men. This part is trickier, not because it didn't happen. Oh, it definitely happened. But because the consequences for same-sex male intimacy were harsher, and so the records are buried deeper. Still, they exist. In cities like Venice, Florence, and Paris, brothels served as meeting places for men who wanted sex with other men. Some disguised themselves as regular clients, others came to negotiate behind closed doors, and some brothel workers, particularly younger boys or androgynous-presenting individuals, catered specifically to them. Let's be clear, many of these boys were coerced, exploited, or trafficked. They were often kept in hidden sections of the brothel, passed off as errand runners or entertainers. The line between survival and exploitation was razor thin. But not all encounters were purely economic. There are personal testimonies, criminal records, even love poems that suggest genuine affection between male brothel workers and their clients, or between the workers themselves. One of the most cited cases comes from Florence in the early 15th century, where a male brothel worker named Giuliano was arrested after being caught in mutual embrace with another man behind a tavern attached to a brothel. They were charged with sodomy, sentenced to public shaming, and exiled. But before his punishment, Giuliano reportedly told the court, "I loved him before he paid me. The coin only gave me permission." That line, preserved in legal Latin, echoes through the centuries like a sigh in stone. There's also the curious case of third gender figures in brothels, people who didn't fit neatly into male or female categories. Some dressed in gender non-conforming ways, others changed their presentation entirely. In parts of medieval Iberia, there are scattered reports of individuals living in brothels who wore women's garb but had the voice of men, or vice versa. They were sometimes ridiculed, sometimes tolerated, and sometimes celebrated, especially if they could sing, dance, or entertain noble clients with a sense of novelty and scandal. Historians still argue over what to call these individuals. Were they trans, non-binary, gender fluid? The terms don't map perfectly across time, and imposing modern labels risks oversimplification. But what is clear is that medieval brothels, for all their brutality, created spaces where gender and desire could blur, where identities outside the norm could exist, if only in shadow. There were codes too, signals passed between those in the know, a red sash tied on the left instead of the right, a hand gesture, a certain way of lighting a candle or offering a drink. These small signs meant everything in a world where a wrong word could mean a beating or a noose. Brothels became not just places of business, but points on an underground map, a hidden network where queerness survived by being invisible to everyone except those who needed to see it. And yet the tragedy was always close. There are heartbreaking court records of lovers torn apart, of women flogged in the streets, of men burned or drowned because their letters were found, because someone overheard, because the world outside the brothel wanted everything to be simple and straight and safe, and it wasn't. But even then, even under threat, people loved, people risked, people found each other in stolen moments behind wine barrels and under shared blankets, in the laughter between shifts, in the long look across a crowded dressing room, in the quiet murmur of "stay with me" just before dawn. So tonight, as the city stretches into silence and the last of the candles flicker low, think of them, the women who found solace in each other's arms, the men who spoke love through coin because they had no other way. The ones who didn't fit into the stories history liked to tell. They were here, they mattered, they still do. By the time the sun is up again, the brothel feels like a different world entirely. Windows are flung wide to let out the stink of candles and flesh. Blankets are aired, and last night's makeup clings to pillowcases like faint regrets. There's the creak of floorboards, the whistle of a pot starting to boil, and the soft shuffle of boots in the hall. But today, someone new has arrived. Not a merchant, not a soldier, and not the local tax collector looking for his cut. No, this man has jewels in his hat, too many buttons on his coat, and the kind of confident swagger that only comes from knowing the law applies differently to you. Congratulations. You've just witnessed a royal brothel tour. That's right. Royalty, nobles, dukes, earls, kings, and their annoying cousins. They didn't just visit brothels in secret. Sometimes they did it on purpose, in groups, as part of an evening's entertainment. And sometimes they brought the court with them. Entourages of musicians, jesters, guards, and the occasional bishop who definitely wasn't supposed to be there but came anyway for moral oversight. These weren't your average transactions. When a king visited a brothel, it wasn't about necessity. It was about spectacle, power, fantasy. It was about saying, I can do this, and you can't stop me. And believe me, no one did stop them. You think the city was going to arrest a prince for slipping out of his palace and into a stew house? Please! They sent extra guards to keep the road clear. Take King Edward IV of England, for example. He was famously fond of women, particularly low-born maidens of the city, which is a very polite way of saying brothel girls with good teeth. He reportedly kept more than one mistress at a time, some housed in brothels paid for with crown funds. Rumour has it that his night tours of London's underbelly were frequent and, well, not subtle. One story claims he left behind a cloak with royal embroidery in a Southwark bathhouse. Someone tried to return it. The Crown denied ownership. Smooth. And it wasn't just England. In France, Charles VI was said to frequent Parisian brothels regularly, sometimes in disguise, sometimes not. During one infamous night, he and several nobles dressed up as wild men, wearing actual branches, tar and feathers, snuck into a brothel and tried to reenact some pagan fertility rite. One torch too close to a branch, and the whole thing caught fire. Several men died. No one ever talked about that as a cautionary tale against brothel visits, just against playing with fire while drunk and covered in pitch. Court jesters sometimes accompanied these trips, providing comic relief or distraction. Their job? Keep everyone laughing and pretend it wasn't awkward when someone's lord-uncle passed out half-naked in a laundry pile. Some even performed acts with brothel workers, dances, riddles, bawdy songs that ended with private encores upstairs. Royalty liked to mix entertainment with debauchery. After all, what's the point of being king if you can't demand both a lute solo and a foot massage at the same time? But these weren't just wild nights. They had consequences. For the women involved, a royal client could be a curse wrapped in coin. Sure, the money was good, better than usual. And yes, there was a chance at favour, maybe even a position at court as a mistress or maid. But more often than not, the attention burned too hot. When kings moved on, their companions were left behind, pregnant, disgraced, or in danger from jealous wives and scheming courtiers. There's an infamous case in Bohemia of a brothel girl who was elevated to mistress of the king, then accused of witchcraft by his advisers just to get rid of her. She was executed. The king married someone else a month later, and of course royal clients weren't exactly gentle. Power doesn't always make people kind. Some came in demanding challenges, ordering multiple women at once, or requesting exotic experiences rooted more in cruelty than curiosity. There were workers who were beaten, scarred, or permanently injured after a royal visit. And justice? Laughable. You couldn't bring a nobleman to court. You were the crime in their eyes. Yet for some women, a royal visit meant an opportunity, a chance to earn more than they'd make in a year, or at least collect a favour they could use later. Some clever madams made sure to flatter the royal ego just enough to earn protection. Your Highness, we would never allow your name to be sullied. Wink, wink. Suddenly, that brothel had guards stationed outside and a reduced tax burden. Sometimes loyalty was bought with lace and discretion. There's a fringe historical moment from 15th century Milan where Duke Filippo Maria Visconti commissioned a private brothel inside one of his castles. It had themed rooms, rotating staff, and even a menu written in Latin for elegance. One of the rooms was called the Room of Silence, where guests were required to act out their desires without speaking. Some historians say it was about power, others say he just didn't like small talk. Who knows? What we do know is that brothels near royal courts were often controlled by royal insiders. A noble cousin might invest in one, a former mistress might run one, her debts paid off by some grateful baron. There were rumours of entire brothel networks in places like Paris and Naples, connected by noble families who used them not just for pleasure, but for politics. Because yes, sometimes the royal brothel visit wasn't about sex at all, it was about alliances, quiet deals, blackmail. Imagine a duke inviting a rival to a brothel, then making sure the right ears were pressed to the wall, the right sketch artist hiding in the laundry basket. Pillow talk could topple thrones. That's why, during periods of political tension, brothel visits by royalty suddenly declined. It wasn't because kings got moral, it was because they got paranoid. No one wanted to be caught pants down during a coup, unless it was their own coup. Then apparently it was fair game. Even among royalty, reputation mattered. A king who visited too many brothels risked scandal. One who never visited at all risked suspicion. Some rulers, especially in religious countries like Spain, took great pains to keep their activities secret. Others leaned into it. Better a public sin than a hidden one French prince reportedly said. Then he fell off a balcony trying to sneak out of a brothel. God's timing, truly. So the next time you hear about medieval kings and their courtly pursuits, remember that some of those pursuits involved rooms with uneven floors, itchy feather beds, and a woman named something like Lettice or Gertrude trying to find her other earring before the guards burst in. Because when it came to brothels, royalty wasn't above the game. They were the game, and everyone else just tried not to lose. It's another quiet morning after a very noisy night, and the brothel feels tense. Not the usual hangover and laundry kind of tension, but something sharper. The workers glance at each other a little too quickly. One of them has a fresh bruise under her eye that no one asks about. And the madam? She's already pulled out the special bottle she keeps under the counter, the one she only touches when things get messy. Because while brothels might seem like chaos contained, there's a more secret layer to them that most people don't see. Under the wine and perfume, past the velvet curtains and coin-stuffed drawers, lies something much colder, much smarter, and much more dangerous. Intelligence. Not the IQ kind, the espionage kind. Tonight, we're diving into the brothel as a spy hub. Because yes, sex, gossip and treason have always gone together like candles, wine and regret. And medieval brothels, with their rotating cast of drunk nobles, scheming merchants and loose-lipped clergy, were perfect little listening posts. If you wanted to know who was funding a rebellion, who was sleeping with whose wife, or which lord was planning to switch allegiances, you didn't need to torture anyone, you just needed to bribe the right madam. Let's start with the women themselves. Brothel workers had one huge advantage over almost everyone else in the medieval world. They were invisible, or rather they were ignored. Men poured their secrets out while naked, drunk, and full of false confidence. They boasted, whined, planned, and they never thought twice about the woman sitting across from them, filing her nails or pouring more wine. But she was listening, every time. Some workers had photographic memories, or close enough. They remembered names, alliances, strange symbols on rings, the weight of certain coin pouches. Others knew how to tease information out gently. "Why don't you tell me about your voyage, sweet lord? What were those letters your servant carried? You looked upset when you arrived? Care to talk about it while I braid your hair?" It didn't feel like interrogation. It felt like flirting. That was the genius of it. And behind them stood the madam, collecting these fragments like breadcrumbs. The smart ones kept ledgers that doubled as blackmail dossiers. Who visited? What they said? What they paid? What they asked for? One whisper here, one letter there, and suddenly she had the kind of leverage that even bishops couldn't ignore. There's a well-documented case from 14th century Florence where a brothel madam named Tessa di Gaeta was arrested, not for running an illegal house, but for possessing coded letters linked to a noble uprising. During the trial, she claimed she didn't understand what the letters meant, but under pressure admitted she'd passed them on to a foreign visitor in exchange for gold. Spy? Informant? Pawn? Hard to say. But her brothel had hosted several meetings between rivals just weeks before a failed assassination attempt on a city official. Coincidence? The court didn't think so, and it wasn't always the women who played informant. Sometimes they were recruited. Kings and noble houses kept informants in brothels, planted workers whose job wasn't just to entertain, but to watch, to record, to manipulate. One letter from the archives of Charles the Bold of Burgundy details instructions to a spy named Helene, embedded in a Brussels brothel. Her assignment: observe visiting envoys and report on any discussions involving trade routes or troop movements. Her cover: charming and discreet with preference for noblemen. A classic. But the game didn't stop at listening. Sometimes brothels were used to plant information. Say you want a rival lord to be exposed as disloyal. Easy. Get one of his spies drunk in a brothel, let him overhear a stage conversation about a fake plot, and wait for the information to reach the wrong ears. It was disinformation by candlelight. Pillow talk turned into political traps. Jesters, too, played a role. Though mostly seen as clowns, court jesters often doubled as informants. They went where the nobles went, heard what others didn't, and reported back to their patrons with jokes laced in meaning. And when a jester joined a nobleman on a brothel visit, it wasn't just for laughs. He watched. He listened. Sometimes he helped steer the conversation to dangerous territory. There's even a fringe report from 15th century Lubeck about a brothel with a secret tunnel connecting it to a nearby merchant hall. Rumour has it that the tunnel allowed messages, and occasionally people, to move without being seen, especially during times of trade embargo and war. The city denied its existence. But in 1892, builders uncovered what appeared to be a bricked-over passage beneath a former bathhouse. Makes you think. And then there were the coded messages, not letters. Those could be intercepted. No, we're talking about messages baked into bread loaves, patterns sewn into corsets, lipstick smudged in shapes on a mirror. One brothel in Bruges allegedly used flower arrangements to signal warnings. A red tulip in the window meant all is safe. A black poppy meant do not enter, enemy inside. It sounds like spy fantasy, but several merchant records mention changing routes or delaying travel due to poor blossoms at the House of Lace. Whether that was code or coincidence, it worked. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how formal these operations really were. Some argue brothel espionage was systemic, part of organised networks used by courts and guilds. Others believe it was more freelance, opportunistic rather than structured. Either way, the result was the same. Brothels were dangerous not just because of disease or violence, but because someone was always watching, listening, waiting to profit from your loose lips and looser morals. But don't forget the risk involved. Spying was deadly. A worker caught passing messages could be tortured or executed. A madam caught hiding a fugitive might lose her property or be burned out overnight. There were no medals, no pensions, just the hope that your secrets were worth more than your silence. Yet they did it anyway. Some for money, some for protection, some for revenge. A few, maybe, out of loyalty to a cause they believed in. Though idealism tends to wear thin when you've got bruises from last night's client, and a dagger hidden under your pillow, just in case. So, as you walk through the brothel one last time before sunrise, think of the girl laughing a little too loud, the madame who just happens to remember the name of a diplomat's dog, the servant carrying laundry with a peculiar stiffness to her gait, like she's got something sewn into the hem of her apron. The candle placed in the wrong window, the drunk lord muttering about borders he wasn't supposed to mention. And ask yourself, in a place where everyone lies for a living, who's telling the truth, and who's selling it? The days blur together now. Smoke-stained mornings, music-laced evenings, and the constant shuffle of boots and bodies through creaky doorways. You lose track of how many faces you've seen come and go. The air in the brothel never quite clears, even with the windows open. It's heavy with perfume breath, and the kind of secrets that hang in the corners long after the door's shut. But tonight, something shifts. Someone's been taken. Not a worker, a client, and not by force, by order. Quiet, swift, and under the cover of too much wine. Because here's another truth about medieval brothels. Sometimes they weren't just places to gather information. They were places to catch people, to trap them, to turn the power of pleasure against the powerful. Tonight, we're digging into one of the most treacherous threads in the brothel web, espionage's sharp cousin, blackmail. When secrets are whispered in dark corners, someone's always listening. And when men strip down in rooms where no one can see them, they forget who's watching. For a clever madam, or a brothel worker with a good memory and a steady hand, this was opportunity on a silver platter. Blackmail in brothels wasn't always formal. Sometimes it was as simple as keeping a noble's stained tunic and returning it only after a coin purse got significantly lighter. Sometimes it was more subtle. What a shame if someone were to mention where you spent last Thursday evening, Your Grace. Just a gentle reminder that silence wasn't free. Ever. But in other cases, blackmail was a machine, a business, an industry. Certain brothels in major cities, Florence, Paris, London, had entire rooms wired for it. Not with microphones, obviously, but with servants stationed in hidden alcoves, walls designed for listening, and peepholes so cleverly placed you'd never notice. Some houses even trained workers specifically for seduction and extraction. Not extraction in the fun way, extraction in the get them talking and don't forget a single word way. One of the most infamous examples comes from 15th century Venice. A nobleman, loyal to the Doge, was caught in bed with the daughter of a rival political family. The madam, whose brothel both families frequented, had positioned a trusted worker in the adjacent room with her ear to a hollowed-out panel. She heard everything: names, plans, confessions of bribery. 2 weeks later, the nobleman was arrested, his house seized. The rival family mysteriously avoided all charges. The brothel, quietly funded by both sides from then on. Because when everyone's dirty, no one can afford to shut you down. Some women turned blackmail into their entire career. They'd retire from sex work and shift to full-time information brokering. A client from their working days became a steady source of income, or a steady target. Others stayed in the game but leveraged what they knew to rise through the ranks. One particularly sharp madam in London's Bankside district used the secrets of her wealthy clients to buy off inspectors, secure better rooms, and even get her workers access to luxury imports. Fine silks, French perfume, Venetian shoes, and she kept ledgers. Hidden, coded, brutal ledgers. If anyone crossed her, she opened a page. These weren't just gossipy tidbits either. The blackmail-worthy secrets included treasonous talk, affairs with married nobles, secret debts, religious blasphemy, plans to defect, and all kinds of things that could get a man hanged, or worse, demoted. And once a man paid once, he'd keep paying, even if the secret faded, because the fear didn't. There's a fringe account from Bruges about a prostitute named Lise, who allegedly ran a short-lived but extremely profitable side hustle by offering to bless clients with rare oils she used to mark their clothing with an invisible dye that only showed under moonlight. She claimed it was just an old trick of the East, but really it was a way to track them. The next time one of her accomplices caught a noble in a compromising location, the faint mark glowed just enough to confirm he'd been with her. She'd never say a word unless asked, and then it came with a fee. But not all blackmail was about money. Sometimes it was about leverage, politics, protection. A brothel under threat from the church might conveniently discover a bishop's misplaced ring or misfiled love note. A city inspector getting too close might receive a polite message reminding him of a night from 3 winters ago that involved 2 bottles of claret and a boy with an excellent memory. The balance of power always shifted, and blackmail was the fulcrum. Of course there were risks. Some clients didn't take kindly to being reminded of their sins. There are documented cases of madams being found dead with no clear culprit, workers disappearing after confiding in the wrong person, or entire brothels burned to the ground in suspicious fires. It was a dangerous game, and not everyone played it well. Some historians argue that blackmail was the true currency of the medieval brothel world, more valuable than sex, wine, or even coin. Once you had someone's secret, you owned a part of them. You didn't have to touch them again. You didn't even have to see them. Just one note, one look, one small reminder could keep the coins rolling in for years. Others believe blackmail was rare, too dangerous, and mostly accidental, opportunistic moments that were exploited only when the stakes were high. Either way, it's clear that brothels weren't passive spaces. They didn't just absorb secrets, they weaponized them. And it wasn't only men who were targeted. Women, wealthy ones, noble ones, cloistered ones, visited brothels too, often in secret. A lady of the court caught visiting a female brothel worker could be destroyed socially, if not legally. Some brothels used that knowledge carefully, not to ruin, but to control. Keep her visiting, keep her paying, keep her scared. So when you picture a medieval brothel, don't just see the beds and the bruises, see the books, the secrets folded into the hems of skirts, the servant who remembers every face, the bottle of ink hidden in the kitchen drawer. See the look the madam gives a nobleman as he stumbles out. Tight-lipped, unreadable, but somehow victorious. Because in this house, nothing is forgotten, and everything has a price. The storm rolls in just past dusk, a slow, dragging sky of bruised clouds that settles over the city like a wool blanket soaked in fear. Rain taps on the windows of the brothel like 1,000 tiny fingers, and the candles flicker with every gust of wind that sneaks through the warped wooden frames. Inside, the mood is different tonight. Quiet, watchful. The laughter is subdued, the wine is poured carefully, and the girls. They're whispering about the widow who was dragged from her home 3 streets over, said to have cursed a milkmaid's cow, or maybe made a magistrate's son impotent. Either way, someone screamed witch, and that was all it took, because for centuries, long before Enlightenment thinkers started questioning the logic of putting people on trial for talking to cats, brothel workers were among the first to feel the heat when witch-hunting fever spread through Europe. They were already outsiders, already sinners, and when fear took hold of a town like a fever, it always came for them first. Let's start with the obvious. Brothel workers were always seen as dangerously close to the edge of morality. They lived outside the expectations of marriage and family. They knew things about bodies, about herbs, about the weaknesses of powerful men. They used charms, oils and poultices to protect themselves. They read the stars. They muttered prayers that weren't quite Latin. So when crops failed, when babies were stillborn, or when someone's cow just stopped giving milk, who do you think people blamed? If you guessed the woman who gave me a strange tea and also once told me my wife smelled like vinegar, congratulations. You've cracked the medieval logic code. The connection between sex work and witchcraft wasn't just made by scared peasants. It was institutional. Clergy, magistrates and inquisitors often lumped sinful women together under the same umbrella of suspicion. If a woman was known for promiscuity, independence or unnatural knowledge, if she lived without a husband and earned her own living, she was already halfway to the stake. Brothel workers ticked all the boxes. Some even admitted under torture to having learned tricks from other women. Techniques that, out of context, sounded suspiciously like spells. Take, for example, the case of Mariette of Lyon, a brothel worker arrested in 1457 on accusations of sorcery. Her crime? Selling love sachets, small bundles of herbs meant to increase desire or affection. Some were made of rosemary and mint, others included poppy seeds and dried orange peels. Pretty tame stuff. But when a noblewoman's husband fell mysteriously ill, after being seen at Mariette's establishment awkwardly enough, the sachets were declared to be instruments of demonic enchantment. She confessed after 3 days of interrogation. She was executed. The noblewoman, it should be noted, was later seen with a new lover and a fancy new necklace. There's also the infamous witch trial in Würzburg in the early 1600s, where several women connected to local brothels were accused not only of consorting with devils, but of transforming into cats to spy on men. One woman, Hilda, was said to have smiled without showing her teeth, and had a mole in the shape of a serpent's tail on her thigh. That was enough. She was stripped, inspected, and condemned. The records say she was burned with no sign of remorse, which is probably hard to show when you're being roasted alive for having a weird birthmark. Here's the part that gets even darker. Many women arrested as witches weren't witches at all, obviously, but their confessions were extracted under torture. And once one name was given, any name in desperation, it set off a chain reaction. Brothel workers, many of whom lived together, relied on each other, and shared secrets, made convenient targets. She knew how to stop bleeding. She mixed a tea that stopped a pregnancy. She whispered something to a man who died later that week. It didn't take much. Witch hunts were about power, fear and control, and brothels, they were places where women seemed to have control, over their bodies, over men, over information. That illusion was enough to terrify the powers that be, so they burned it down, both figuratively and literally. Better to destroy the place than admit it was necessary. Some brothel workers tried to distance themselves from any hint of magic. They destroyed their herbs, burned their charm bags, and stopped offering remedies. Others leaned into the rumours, charging extra for magical services, wearing black veils or claiming to speak to spirits. It was a risk, sure, but in some places being feared was safer than being ignored. There's even a fringe account of a brothel in Transylvania. Yes, that Transylvania, where the madam supposedly styled herself as a moon priestess and conducted candlelit rituals to attract clients and protection. Some called it blasphemy, others called it marketing. Either way, she stayed in business longer than most and disappeared mysteriously the same night an inquisitor was found drowned in the river, clutching a bundle of her blessing herbs. The scholarly debate continues. Were brothel workers really accused of witchcraft in large numbers, or have the records simply exaggerated the overlap? Some historians argue that the connection was more symbolic than literal, that society projected its fears of female power onto sex workers and witches interchangeably. Others point to trial records showing a very real pattern of persecution that targeted anyone outside traditional gender roles, with brothel workers topping that list. Either way, the link is undeniable, and it wasn't just in Catholic Europe. In parts of Islamic Spain, for example, brothels were similarly associated with magic and corruption. Local authorities sometimes referred to the women as sorceresses of the gate, and folk tales warned young men of being charmed into ruin by women who smelled of cinnamon and never blinked. Again, fear disguised as morality, control disguised as protection. So now, as you hear the thunder roll and feel the house shiver slightly under a wind that doesn't feel entirely natural, remember this. It didn't take much to get branded a witch. A look, a rumour, a little too much, knowledge. And if you happened to live in a brothel, you were already halfway to the stake before you even opened your mouth. There's something terrifyingly efficient about a world that can make you both indispensable and disposable at the same time. The rain passes by dawn, leaving behind puddles like little silver mirrors in the uneven stone streets. The sky is pale and quiet, the kind of morning that pretends last night never happened. But inside the brothel, nothing is forgotten. A new day means new tricks to survive, and the workers are already preparing, not for bed, but for baths, or at least for the performance of bathing. Because tonight we're walking into the steamy, slippery, highly questionable overlap between cleanliness and sex, the medieval bathhouse, or as it was often known in practice, the brothel with soap. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, medieval people didn't even bathe that much, right? Ah, classic myth. But wrong. Medieval folks loved bathing, when they could afford it. Public bathhouses were common in cities and towns across Europe, and while they were officially places for cleanliness and health, they very quickly became something else entirely. By the 13th century, the line between bathhouse and brothel was so blurry it might as well have been soaking in a wooden tub. Let's set the scene. You walk into a bathhouse in, say, 14th century Vienna. The first thing you notice is the heat. The air is thick with steam, and the scent of lavender, pine resin, and boiling lye soap. Behind a thin screen, someone is singing off-key while buckets of water slosh onto warm stone floors. You're offered a towel, a wooden comb, and a weak smile from a girl whose job is technically to help you wash. Technically. These attendants, almost always women, were called baigneresses in France or simply bathers elsewhere. And while many started their shifts scrubbing backs and heating stones, their duties often evolved by request. Want someone to shampoo your hair and nothing else? Fine. Want someone to shampoo your ego for an hour while you sit naked in a shallow pool? That'll cost extra. Want someone to join you in the pool and forget that hygiene was ever the goal? That's where things got interesting. Bathhouse workers weren't always prostitutes, at least not in title. But in function, let's say the job description was flexible. In many cities, bathhouses were known fronts for sex work, and everyone, from the mayor to the local baker, knew it. In fact, some towns issued dual licenses, one for bathing, one for accompanying services. If the clerk stamped both, congratulations. Your business was officially steamy in every sense, and they weren't subtle. Bathhouses advertised with paintings of nude couples, with signs showing lovers in embrace, or, if you were feeling particularly bold, a set of crossed towels tied with red string. In cities like Paris, Prague and Milan, bathhouses offered packages, a soak, a shave, a meal and a companion. The original spa day, if your idea of relaxation involved hot water and mild scandal. Of course, the church hated it. Not the bathing necessarily, just the everything else. Clergy gave sermons about the moral rot seeping from the bathhouses, warning that soap washed away decency right along with dirt. Some towns passed laws separating bathhouses from brothels, forcing owners to pick one licence or the other. Spoiler alert, most picked the one with more coin. There's a particularly hilarious case in Cologne where city officials banned bathhouse workers from performing acts of delight while in the water. The rule was immediately ignored. One inspector reported that the bathhouses simply repositioned the tubs so that the sins occurred behind the large potted plants, because nothing says modesty like foliage and moaning, and the tubs themselves, don't picture marble or porcelain. Most were massive wooden barrels, deep enough for 2 or 3, with water that was warmish at the start and a little grim by the end of the night. Workers ladled in hot water from iron pots, tried to scoop out floating grime, and added rose petals when things got particularly suspicious. Soap was lye-based and stung like betrayal. Shampoo was made from herbs and sometimes egg yolk. The real luxury, heat. Bathhouses burned through wood like gossip in a convent. Health officials occasionally cracked down, demanding inspections for cleanliness, disease control and decency. One ordinance in London required bathhouse workers to scrub all surfaces with vinegar at the end of each shift. Another in Florence stated that no customer shall remain unclothed with a woman for longer than the time it takes to recite 1 Our Father and 2 Hail Marys. You can imagine how strictly that was enforced. Here's a quirky historical footnote. Some bathhouses had private steam closets, tiny wooden chambers where clients could sweat out impurities or rendezvous in semi-darkness. One brothel bath hybrid in Bologna reportedly offered spiritual sweats, claiming that the heat purged the sins from the body. They even provided prayer beads, dual purpose, of course. So were bathhouses really brothels with soap? That depends on the time, the place, and the interpretation. Some scholars argue that many bathhouses were run by the same people who managed brothels, with workers rotating between both depending on need. Others insist that true bathhouses maintained a level of respectability, at least until the back door creaked open and the candles dimmed. What's clear is that the overlap was deliberate. Water made people feel clean, but also open, vulnerable, relaxed. It lowered defences, it set a mood. And in a world where public decency was strict but private vice was booming, bathhouses offered the perfect camouflage. Even the architecture played along. Narrow hallways, layered rooms, curtained alcoves. A visitor could arrive for a bath and leave 3 hours later looking flushed, cleaner and slightly dazed, without anyone able to prove much of anything. And let's not forget the role these places played in community. Bathhouses weren't just for illicit trysts, they were social hubs. Deals were made, songs were sung, women gossiped, men argued politics, and somewhere in the steam, lives were changed. A brothel was transactional, a bathhouse pretended it wasn't. Which is why, over time, the bathhouse-brothel hybrid became harder to pin down. Cities passed stricter laws, inspectors visited more often. By the late 1500s, many bathhouses either shut down or leaned fully into sex work, dropping the soap altogether. But for a few centuries they offered something strange and in between, a place where you could be naked and not judged, at least not until the water turned cold. So next time you imagine the Middle Ages as grim and grubby, remember this. Someone was sitting in a warm bath with a goblet of spiced wine, being scrubbed by candlelight and debating whether to pay for the linen and extra companionship option. And outside, a preacher stood on a corner shouting about eternal damnation, while secretly wondering if he could sneak in before the water got too cloudy. The light coming through the brothel windows today is sharp and golden, catching on the edges of silk sashes and dangling earrings. It glints off polished boots and beads of sweat on powdered foreheads. Today something's different. The women aren't just working, they're parading. They strut through the common rooms with hips that say, "Look at me," and eyes that dare you to not. Their skirts are extra wide, their sleeves unnecessarily slashed, and their shoes far too delicate for the cobblestones outside. In short, they're dressed better than half the noblewomen in the city. And that isn't an accident. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most outrageous and misunderstood aspects of brothel life. Fashion. Yes, fashion. Because brothel workers in medieval Europe weren't just known for their profession, they were seen. And in many cities they were required by law to be seen in very specific ways. Clothing wasn't just about fabric and flair, it was control, regulation, humiliation, but also, somehow, defiance. Let's rewind a bit. In many medieval cities, sex workers were legally required to wear distinctive clothing to separate them from honest women. It started simple: a coloured sash, a striped hood, a badge on the sleeve. But as time went on, the rules got stranger. Some cities required prostitutes to wear yellow, a colour associated with disease and disgrace. Others demanded bells on the hem of dresses or cloaks with deliberately ridiculous patterns. Florence at one point insisted on one red shoe and one black, because symmetry apparently was a virtue reserved for the morally upright. These were sumptuary laws, rules that dictated who could wear what based on class, gender and morality. And for sex workers, they were brutally specific. In London's Southwark district, women were banned from wearing veils or cloaks that covered too much of the face or body. Modesty was for wives. In Vienna, they couldn't wear fur or velvet. In Venice, they were forbidden to wear pearls, unless, of course, they paid a bribe, in which case sparkle away, darling. But here's where it gets complicated. Instead of being crushed by these rules, many sex workers used them, twisted them, to stand out even more. You want me to wear yellow? Fine. I'll wear all yellow. Gloves, corset, feathers. I'll be a walking sunflower with cleavage. You say I can't wear pearls? Great, I'll sew fake ones into my sleeves until I shimmer like a chandelier. You want a striped hood? I'll match it with shoes so red they could start fires. They turned shame into spectacle. They made visibility a weapon. Because in a business where attention meant income, the best-dressed woman in the room often got the coin, and if people were going to judge them anyway, they might as well perform. Madams too leaned into this. The wealthier ones dressed in silks and brocades, dripping with rings and gold-threaded hairnets. Their outfits weren't just fashion statements, they were armour, proof that despite society's scorn they held power, wealth, influence. In some towns, madams even loaned extravagant garments to their workers for special feast days or city festivals, knowing full well it would cause a stir. Let the bishops clutch their rosaries, let the wives hiss, it brought in business. There's an actual recorded incident in 15th century Augsburg where a group of brothel workers showed up to a church parade in matching crimson gowns and were immediately arrested for disturbing the peace of modest women. Their gowns were confiscated, but the story ends with the madams suing to get them back, and winning. The court ruled that since the women had paid for the fabric themselves, they were entitled to reclaim it. The judge reportedly refused to look anyone in the eye during the verdict. Another tale from Lyon tells of a brothel that hosted a fashion evening during Lent, a time when everyone else was supposed to be in sackcloth and silence. The workers paraded in peacock feathers, painted their eyelids blue with crushed lapis, and wore gold-tipped boots. The local clergy were outraged. The local men, less so. That night, the brothel made more coin than any other week of the year. Of course, this wasn't just about flair. Clothes were currency, status, protection. A woman in fine clothing could sometimes pass for someone above her station, or at least earn a few extra seconds of respect before the insult started. Workers with enough savings often kept a church outfit or emergency disguise tucked away, something plain and decent to wear if they needed to blend in, visit a sick relative, or flee town in a hurry. Here's a quirky fringe fact. In some cities, brothel workers were actually allowed to dress extravagantly during certain festivals or royal visits. Officials figured it made the city look more colourful, more prosperous, like live medieval marketing. So for a few days a year, the women could shine, strut, and sparkle with impunity, right up until the bells tolled, and it was back to your assigned stripes and shame. There's an ongoing debate among historians about the role of fashion in brothel identity. Some argue that the required outfits were pure stigma, designed to dehumanize. Others suggest that over time, sex workers reclaimed those symbols and infused them with meaning and pride. Think of it as the difference between a scarlet letter and a neon sign. One is punishment, the other is strategy, and some of the influence bled upward. Nobles, always looking for the next scandal chic trend, occasionally copied brothel styles. Deep necklines, tight sleeves, patterned stockings. There's a famous moment in late medieval Paris where a court lady was reprimanded for dressing like a common woman of the street. She responded by inventing a new neckline, so low it was basically an invitation, and it caught on like wildfire. Fashion, after all, doesn't care where it comes from, just how it looks. The irony? These same sex workers were often banned from wearing certain religious or ceremonial garments, even if they'd earned them. One woman in Nuremberg was refused burial in a veil she had purchased with her own wages. Too fine for someone of her kind. It was removed before burial, burned, a final insult after a lifetime of being seen but never respected. Still, the power of dress lingered. In many brothels, the first thing a new worker received wasn't a bed. It was a set of clothes, something eye-catching, something that said, "Here I am." Whether it was yellow or crimson or stitched with knock-off pearls, it was a uniform of survival, of performance, of rebellion, quiet or loud. So next time you picture a medieval prostitute, don't imagine rags and shame. Picture feathers, picture satin, picture someone who knew the rules of visibility and bent them into a weapon, someone who turned punishment into performance, and performance into profit. And maybe, just maybe, left behind more than just fabric when they were gone. The bells ring again, it's market day, and the brothel's common room is unusually empty. Most of the women are out. Not for rest, not for fun, but for errands. They're slipping through the crowd like practiced ghosts, blending into the chaos of stalls and hawkers and mud-slick cobbles. One's buying candles, another is picking up vinegar to scrub the floors. Two are waiting for a visit from the man who never makes eye contact but always asks for payment in exact coin, never more, never less. Because while most of the city thinks brothels are fueled by sin and scandal, what actually keeps the whole machine running is far less flashy. Money. And lots of it. Today we're cracking open the ledgers to see how the medieval brothel economy actually worked, and it's not what you think. Behind the wine and window displays and lace-up corsets was a thriving, carefully managed and highly strategic operation of taxes, tokens, fines, wages, bribes, and yes, the occasional condemned coin passed in a shaky hand after midnight. Let's begin with the basics. A medieval brothel, especially a sanctioned one, operated like a small business, and often very profitable one. It had a manager, usually a madam, a staff, the workers, cooks, guards, sometimes musicians, suppliers, linen merchants, herbalists, wine dealers, and overhead costs that would make even the most ruthless landlord sweat. Rent, candles, bedding, guards, food, drink and clothing. Not to mention the endless parade of fees handed down from local authorities. This wasn't just a house of pleasure, it was a financial ecosystem, and that's where taxes came in. In many medieval cities, brothels were taxed openly, not just the house itself, but the workers individually. Some were charged a weekly licensing fee to operate within the city, others had to pay per client. In Toulouse, a sex worker's name might be entered into a tax register, followed by the phrase, "paid for her body's work." No euphemisms, just numbers. And the cities, they didn't complain. In fact, the taxes collected from brothels went directly into public works, roads, bridges, defensive walls, repairs to city gates. There's even documentation from 14th century London where a brothel's tax contribution helped fund the rebuilding of a fire-damaged Guildhall. A little civic irony. A place condemned by preachers but essential to city budgets. Some cities got so comfortable with this arrangement that they created entire financial categories for brothel income. Southwark, for example, included stew money in their official annual accounts. Nuremberg had a pleasure tax funneled from licensed houses straight into the city coffers. Even the church got its cut, either through direct property ownership, Bishop of Winchester, or through silent partnerships. But the coin wasn't always clean. A darker layer of the brothel economy involved condemned currency. These were coins removed from circulation, clipped, counterfeit, or corrupted in some way, but still passed around within brothels. Why? Because workers weren't always paid in fresh silver. Some clients brought old coin, some brought foreign coin, some brought coin they'd stolen which didn't spend well in more respectable establishments. So the brothel became a kind of financial grey zone, where anything with a faint glint might be accepted, weighed or filed down to make change. And then there were tokens. In some regions, particularly in France, and parts of the Low Countries, brothels issued their own jetons, small stamped pieces of metal, wood or bone, used in place of coin. These tokens could be purchased at the front in exchange for time, drinks or services. Think of them as medieval drink tickets, but for considerably less wholesome events. They offered a layer of discretion for clients who didn't want to be seen passing cash directly into a madam's hand, and they helped control theft inside the house. Madams kept detailed ledgers of everything, who owed what, who hadn't paid, who received a discount for bringing wine, who got banned for not tipping. One brothel in Frankfurt even imposed late fees. If you paid for 30 minutes and stayed for 45, they'd charge extra, unless of course you were a noble. Nobles rarely paid late fees, but they always drank the expensive wine. The workers themselves often received only a portion of the money. A cut went to the madam, a cut to the house, a cut to the local guards for protection, and a cut to the tacksman who didn't care if your wrists ached or your boots had holes. If you were lucky, you kept enough to eat well and maybe save up for a shawl without holes in it. If not, you borrowed. From whom? The madam, who added interest. This debt cycle was brutal. Many workers became trapped, unable to leave because they owed too much for clothing, bedding or medicine. In some cities they couldn't legally leave without repaying their debt in full. Others required an exit fee, paid either by the worker or occasionally by a benefactor. And no, the city didn't care if that benefactor was a creepy baron with bad intentions. Here's a quirky fringe detail. In parts of Spain, brothel workers paid their taxes in kind rather than coin. Jars of olive oil, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth. These were turned over to city warehouses and redistributed to churches or charitable kitchens. So the food eaten by orphans might have been indirectly paid for by someone named Clara with very strong thighs and a knack for upselling wine. Even theft and fines became part of the financial machine. If a client stole something, a cup, a pillow, a worker's shoes, the madam might report it, but more often she just charged the next client extra to cover the loss. And if a worker broke house rules, late to curfew, too drunk to work, slapped a client instead of smiling, they'd be fined. The fines were entered into the ledger. Sometimes they could be worked off, sometimes not. The numbers stayed until they were paid or someone disappeared. And don't think the economy stopped at the brothel's doors. Outside, entire micro-industries thrived on brothel traffic. Flower sellers, musicians, seamstresses, rat catchers, apothecaries who sold dubious stamina potions. A man heading to the brothel might stop to buy perfume, wine, or even special cakes, known to lift spirits. And someone was making money off every step of that trip. So no, medieval brothels weren't just scandal factories. They were financial powerhouses, engines of commerce, quietly necessary in cities that pretended to hate them but made full use of their coin. And every time a preacher banged a pulpit about morality, somewhere nearby a brothel worker was counting change by candlelight, wondering if she had enough to fix that cracked window before the next storm rolled in. Because sin, it turns out, paid for quite a lot of clean things. The wind shifts this afternoon, sharp and strange like it's trying to say something, and the brothel feels tense in a way that isn't just hangover or hunger. There's a hum, low and electric, moving through the streets outside, a different kind of foot traffic. Not the usual loitering clients or gossiping fishwives. This is angrier, faster, boots, not slippers, voices rising, not flirting. Something is happening, and you can feel it in your bones. Because for all the brothel's quiet power, the taxes, the secrets, the silk and survival, sometimes the line snapped, and when it did, cities exploded. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the dark, violent moments when the world outside came crashing in, the brothel riots, when the people, regular people, poor people, angry people, decided they'd had enough, and they came with fire. First, let's be clear, these weren't moral crusades led by priests with holy water and loud opinions. The most explosive brothel riots weren't about purity, they were about class, tension, desperation, and more often than not, resentment that the women inside the brothel were somehow doing better than the starving wives outside. Take Paris, for example, in 1391. A crowd of women stormed a licensed brothel near the Rue Saint-Denis. They smashed windows, tore down curtains, and beat one of the workers with a broom handle. Why? Because her dress was nicer than theirs, because they saw her leaving the market with fresh cherries, because their husbands had been spending money there while their own children gnawed on dry crusts at home. It wasn't about religion. It was rage. Plain and raw. And the brothel wasn't just tolerated, it was protected. By city officials, by guards, by landlords who quietly enjoyed the taxes. That protection made people furious. When the rest of the city was suffering during food shortages, plagues or political unrest, why were they still working? Why did they still have coin? Sometimes riots began after a single incident. A client beat a girl too badly. A worker insulted a respectable woman in the street. A noble's son got too drunk, too loud, too arrogant, and the townsfolk had simply had enough. They gathered torches, broke the doors, pulled women out by their hair. It happened in Ghent. It happened in Lyon. It happened in Norwich, where one of the oldest licensed brothels in town was completely burned to the ground in 1450 during a riot that started over bread prices. Here's the twist. Sometimes these riots weren't against the brothel workers. They were led by them. Not all the women inside were helpless or content. Some were furious, trapped, sick of being taxed, fined, controlled. In Nuremberg in 1505, a group of sex workers protested a citywide curfew that limited their hours. They refused to stay inside. They blocked the street. They even set fire to a merchant's cart in retaliation after he called them coin-stealing lice. The city panicked. Officials met behind closed doors, and then, classic medieval solution, they raised taxes on ale instead. There's an account from 15th century Prague of a full-blown uprising among brothel workers after a local bishop tried to revoke their operating licence. The women organised, marched, delivered a petition written by a scribe who admitted he was compensated in methods not typical of his trade. The petition didn't work. The brothel was shuttered. But within a week, half the city's alehouses had turned into unofficial brothels. Same women, just without tax forms. That's the thing. Riots didn't end the brothel trade. They just shifted it. The houses might burn, but the system adapted. Someone set up shop in a cellar. Someone offered companionship behind a tapestry in the back of a tavern. Someone worked out of a boat tied beneath the docks. You can't riot away demand. And the city knew it. Still, the threat of violence lingered. Brothels started hiring their own guards. Some were just hired muscle, former soldiers, disfigured brawlers, or desperate men who couldn't get work elsewhere. Others were lovers of the workers themselves, paid in favours or leftovers. Either way, they kept watch. If someone came to throw stones, they threw back. But fire was harder to stop, and brothels burned often. Sometimes they were set ablaze during larger revolts, part of wider social collapses. During the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, several brothels were looted and destroyed by mobs who saw them as symbols of urban corruption. When the German Bundschuh rebellions flared, houses of sin were targeted alongside tax offices and city halls, not because of sex, but because of inequality. Brothels, especially licensed ones, were seen as complicit in the machinery that kept the poor and the powerful entertained, and not all the damage came from outside. Some brothels burned because of mistakes, candles knocked over, drunken brawls, clients refusing to leave. One in Bordeaux went up in flames after a group of university students got into a fight over a lute. The lute was smashed, the table tipped, the curtains caught. The women escaped through the cellar, but the house was gone by morning. The students were fined. The lute owner claimed he was smitten with grief and flame alike. There's a fringe story from Bruges of a brothel riot that began with a goose. Yes, an actual goose. A worker kept it as a pet. A client insulted it. She insulted him back. He slapped her. The other. Women jumped him. The goose bit his leg. A fight broke out in the street. By nightfall, the brothel was trashed. The goose had vanished, and the city issued a bizarre decree banning livestock within the walls of houses of comfort. You can't make this up. Some historians argue that brothel riots were part of a larger pattern of resistance, small acts of rebellion against systems of control, not organised revolutions, but pressure points. Others see them as chaotic emotional outbursts, explosions of resentment that had no real effect long term. But one thing is clear, they happened, often, and when they did, they left scars. For the workers, the aftermath was brutal. Even if they survived, they might lose everything. Clothes, shelter, income. Some were arrested for inciting unrest, as if their mere presence had summoned the torches. Others vanished into nearby cities, changed their names, started over. Maybe. And yet the brothel always came back. Maybe not the same building, maybe not the same name, but the trade never stayed dead for long. Someone always found a new room, a new curtain, a new set of rules to break. Because as long as there was hunger and power and people looking for an escape, the brothel would return. Smouldering, perhaps, but still standing. The air tonight feels thinner somehow, like the city's holding its breath. In the brothel, the windows are latched shut. Not to keep out the weather, but to keep someone from listening. The workers talk in low voices. The madam's pacing again, her keys jangling faintly at her hip. Outside, you hear the shuffle of a patrol, the official kind. Uniformed men, torches in hand, faces set in grim lines. They're not here for fun, they're not here for coin, they're here for law, or what passes for it. And in places like this, that's always dangerous. Because for all the brothel's shadowy deals, laughter, strategy, and scandal, none of it could truly exist without the looming threat of legal control. Tonight, we're peering into the iron-bound books and smoky backrooms of medieval justice, how brothels were regulated, punished, tolerated, and used by the very systems that claim to despise them. Let's start with the obvious contradiction. In many medieval cities, prostitution was technically illegal and regulated. It sounds insane, and it kind of was. On paper, sex work was condemned as immoral, sinful, and a threat to Christian order. But in practice, city leaders quietly allowed brothels to operate, often openly, so long as they followed certain rules and paid certain people. Think of it as sin with a permit. Some towns, like Amsterdam or Cologne, issued official brothel licenses. These often came with a laundry list of requirements: no soliciting outside the premises, no married women allowed to work, no services on holy days, unless the client was travelling and very persuasive. Brothels were to be kept clean, orderly, and above all, contained. The moment their noise or scandal spilled into the street, the city came knocking, and when they came, it was with inspectors, clerks, occasionally a priest. They didn't come to arrest anyone, not unless they were really looking for a scapegoat. No, they came to make sure the rules were being followed. Bedding was inspected, ledgers reviewed, workers counted. If someone looked too young or too injured, the madam might face a fine, or worse, lose her licence. But as long as the brothel paid its taxes, didn't get too loud, and didn't host any nobility too publicly, the inspectors mostly just nodded and moved on. Still, the threat of punishment hung heavy, because while the brothel might be licensed, individual workers were rarely protected. If a client complained, if a bishop got angry, if a scandal caught the wrong attention, then it didn't matter how many receipts you had in your ledger, you were a criminal. One of the most common charges? Disorderly conduct. A conveniently vague phrase that covered everything from talking back to a client, to fighting in the street, to wearing the wrong shoes on the wrong day. Women could be fined, jailed, or even flogged publicly for being too visible, and if someone claimed you'd tempted a married man into sin, that was your crime, not his. In some cities, women arrested for prostitution were marched through the streets in humiliating penance processions, barefoot, heads shaved, signs around their necks. In others, they were locked in correctional houses, where they were retrained to be laundresses or servants. These institutions were brutal, underfunded, and often just prisons in disguise. There's a notorious case from Avignon in the early 1400s, where a brothel worker named Beatrice was arrested after an argument with a visiting cardinal. She'd allegedly mocked him after he couldn't perform. Her punishment? Public whipping, followed by forced relocation to a monastery for moral correction. She escaped after 3 weeks, rumour has it by disguising herself as a nun. The cardinal? Promoted. But punishment wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was financial. If a woman tried to leave a brothel with debts unpaid, the city could block her from taking other work. Or worse, they could mark her as a habitual harlot, a phrase that shows up disturbingly often in legal records, and banish her altogether. Some ended up wandering, working under false names in towns where no one knew their faces. Others didn't make it out. And then there were the show trials, the ones where someone, usually a wealthy client, needed a distraction from a larger scandal. In those cases, a brothel would suddenly find itself under siege, the madam arrested, the workers interrogated, sometimes tortured. The client's name never appeared in the records, of course, but the fallout always did. One fringe case from Milan involved a magistrate who, after being accused of embezzlement, redirected attention by claiming he'd uncovered a demonic circle of carnal corruption operating in a brothel on Via della Rosa. 4 women were arrested, 2 were imprisoned without trial, 1 disappeared. The magistrate kept his job for 5 more years. Despite this, brothels also used the legal system when they could. Smart madams cultivated relationships with local officials, offering them discounts, discretion, or even flat-out bribes. Some even kept favour books, where they noted which officials liked which services. Not blackmail exactly, just leverage. If you knew a judge preferred brunettes and always left his gloves behind, well, maybe your tax inspection could wait another month. Cities were often complicit. They needed brothels to manage what they saw as male appetites. Better the sin be contained than spread across alleyways and behind church pews. So brothels were quietly encouraged, even protected. And when city leaders cracked down, it was almost always performative, burning one house to show piety while 3 more opened across the river. There's an ongoing scholarly debate over whether brothels were truly legal in the Middle Ages. Some historians argue they were simply tolerated, part of the grey area where necessity outweighed morality. Others point to city records and licenses as proof of de facto legality. But both sides agree on one thing. The law didn't protect the women, it used them, and the irony. The same church that railed against prostitution sometimes owned the property brothels stood on. In Southwark, London, many brothels were technically on land owned by the Bishop of Winchester, which meant the women working there were nicknamed Winchester geese. They paid rent to the church. They were buried outside consecrated ground. So tonight, as the last patrol clatters past the brothel and the madam finally unclenches her jaw, you understand the game. This place exists not in spite of the law, but because of it. Maintained by it. Trapped by it. A balancing act of survival and silence. Because in the medieval world, justice wasn't blind. It saw everything. It just chose who to punish. By morning, the tension eases, just a little. A loaf of bread appears on the kitchen table, warm and stolen. The girl hums while scrubbing wine from a bodice, her voice cracking now and then like a fire that's forgotten how to roar. And upstairs, someone is pretending to sleep, though everyone knows her client left before dawn. Life in the brothel doesn't stop just because the world outside clenches its fists. It adapts, it adjusts, and sometimes it even mourns, quietly, carefully, behind locked doors. Because for all the sex, politics, scandal and coins passed under candlelight, the people inside these walls were still human. They got sick, they got tired, and they died. So tonight we're doing something different. We're slowing down. We're walking past the painted faces and pulled up skirts and into the quieter corners of medieval brothels where grief lived like an uninvited tenant. We're talking about death. Death in a brothel was a different kind of complicated, not just because it happened, though it did more often than anyone wanted to admit, but because of how it was handled. With shame, with silence. With a lot of hurried scrubbing and quiet prayers no one would ever say out loud in a church. Let's start with the practical side. Sex work was dangerous. The risk of injury was constant. Violence from clients, disease, infection from minor wounds that, in a world without antibiotics, could become lethal in a week. And then there was childbirth, always a looming threat. Contraception existed, sort of, in the form of herbal brews and leather pouches soaked in vinegar, but it didn't always work. When a woman became pregnant, it changed everything. Some tried to hide it. Others fled. Some didn't survive the birth. And when a worker died, the city didn't exactly offer a eulogy. In many medieval towns, prostitutes were denied burial in consecrated ground. Too sinful, too tainted. They were considered outside the church's grace. So when one of them died, whether by sickness, childbirth, accident or worse, the madam had to figure it out. Quietly. Quickly. In Southwark, bodies were often buried on the outskirts, in what's now called Crossbones Graveyard. No headstones, no names. Just a shallow trench and a handful of stolen prayers. A few coins if they were lucky. A ribbon, maybe. Something soft in a world that rarely was. There's a record from 1389 of a young woman in Bruges who died from fever after being locked in a room with a violent client for 3 days. When her body was found, the brothel's madam was fined for failing to report the death in a timely fashion, not for the death itself. The woman was buried at night by 2 workers who reportedly used a broken cart and a single candle. Her name never made it into the city registry. Some brothels kept their own small burial plots, unmarked and hidden behind hedges or beneath orchards. These weren't official, they were personal. Madame sometimes planted herbs or wildflowers over the graves, rosemary for remembrance, lavender to keep the air sweet. Workers passed the spots without speaking, but they knew. And when someone went missing and didn't return, they'd glance out toward the garden with a kind of hollow understanding. Of course, not all deaths were quiet. When disease swept through a city, plague, mostly, but also smallpox, dysentery, sweating sickness, the brothels were hit hard. Bodies in close contact, poor ventilation, reused linens, and clients who came from everywhere and brought everything. During the Black Death, many brothels simply closed either by force or by fear. Some madams fled, taking what money they could. Others stayed and died alongside their workers. One fringe story from Avignon tells of a brothel where every woman but one succumbed to the plague within a week. The survivor, Agnes supposedly, locked the door from the outside, left a note carved into the wall, God forgive us all, and disappeared. Years later, someone claimed to have seen her working in a convent kitchen, silent and grey-haired. Whether it's true or not, the story stuck. A ghost tale for hard times. But here's the part no one talks about. Despite all the fear and shame around brothel deaths, there was also community. These women, cast out, mocked, fined, and labelled, cared for each other when no one else would. When someone got sick, another woman sat by her side. When someone broke down after losing a child or being beaten, there was usually a quiet hand on the shoulder, a cup of something warm, a wordless kind of comfort. They grieved together, and sometimes they laughed through it. Not because it was funny, but because laughter was a rebellion against everything they weren't supposed to feel. Some brothels held their own rituals for the dead. A candle left burning in the window overnight. A scrap of clothing pinned to a wall like a whisper of the person who'd worn it. On certain days, someone would pour wine onto the ground just outside the front step. "For the girls we lost," they'd mutter. No one asked questions. Everyone understood. And when a worker died with no one to mourn her, no family, no lover, no clients who remembered her name, it was often the madam who did what little could be done. A small bundle of coins placed in a cloth, a cheap wooden cross laid gently over the grave. Not out of sentiment, maybe, but out of obligation, respect. A nod to the fact that, whatever else you thought of these women, they worked. They endured. They survived longer than anyone expected, until they didn't. There's a debate among scholars about whether these death rituals were common or exceptional. Some argue that most brothel deaths were erased, forgotten, buried, wiped away like stains from a floor. Others insist that there was an underground culture of care, quiet but strong, passed from madam to madam like a worn key. Either way, traces remain. Unmarked graves, ledger notations, a single rose bush growing behind a brothel wall that no one can remember planting, and the clients, rarely involved. When a girl died, the men who'd paid to lie with her rarely asked questions. Some didn't even notice she was gone. Others just moved on to someone younger, someone new. A few brought wine. Fewer still left coin for her family, not knowing she hadn't seen her family since the day she crossed the city gates, with 3 coppers and a shredded pair of shoes. So next time you picture a medieval brothel, don't forget this part. Don't forget the women who didn't make it to old age. The ones who didn't become madams or run away to farmsteads or marry the 3rd son of a lonely baron. Don't forget the women who stayed, worked, gave everything, and then were quietly gone. Because for every story of scandal there's a shadow behind it, and sometimes that shadow's just a name no one speaks anymore. The scent of damp earth still clings to the corners of the house, even though the rain stopped yesterday. A pair of muddy boots sits by the back door and no one's claiming them. Upstairs someone coughs, dry, sharp, like it's trying to escape the body that keeps dragging it out. The brothel carries on, of course. It always does, but it's quieter, heavier, because there's something that's crept in and settled behind the curtains and inside the bones of the women. Age. Tonight, we're walking into one of the most uncomfortable, least discussed realities of medieval brothel life, the question of what happens when you're no longer young. Because in a trade built on fantasy and appearance, age was its own kind of death sentence. Slow, silent, and sometimes worse than the real thing. Let's start with the simple fact. Sex work in the Middle Ages didn't come with retirement plans. There were no pensions for prostitutes, no guilds offering old age support, no safety net if your knees gave out or your back stopped cooperating. A worker in her 30s, let alone her 40s, was considered past her prime. And in an era where people died in their 30s anyway, aging out happened fast. It didn't matter how skilled you were, how many secrets you knew, or how many songs you could sing with your mouth full of wine and your eyes full of tears. The clients wanted youth, plump cheeks, high voices, smooth thighs. Age brought lines, scars, aches. Age made men uncomfortable, reminded them that beauty didn't last, and maybe neither would they. So what did aging workers do? Well, if you were lucky and smart, you aimed for promotion. Becoming a madam was the golden ticket. It wasn't easy. You had to be tough, connected, able to manage a dozen personalities and half a dozen drunk clients with the grace of a duchess and the brutality of a butcher. But it came with stability, authority, your own key to the coin box. Many madams had once been workers themselves. They learned the trade inside and out, memorised what made the money flow and what made it stop. They saved, they bribed, they waited for the old madam to retire or die or vanish. And when the moment came, they stepped in, usually with better shoes and a list of rules no one wanted to test. But not everyone could climb that ladder. Some women transitioned into less visible roles, cleaning, laundering, cooking. They stayed within the brothel but out of sight, folding linens and pretending not to hear what was happening upstairs. Others tried to reinvent themselves, peddling herbs, reading fortunes, offering spiritual healing under the guise of prayer. A few even married, not always for love, often for shelter. A widower with land, a gatekeeper who needed company, a second chance sort of arrangement. Not glamorous, but safer. Then there were those who drifted, who left the city, or tried to, who packed up their worn dresses, tied their coins into a scarf, and walked towards some place where no one recognised them. Some found rest, some found worse. One woman in Lübeck reportedly joined a travelling troupe of actors at the age of 38, billed as Madame Nightingale. She sang bawdy songs and told fortunes until her voice gave out. The troupe buried her under an apple tree with a wine bottle for a headstone, probably the most affection she'd gotten in years. Aging didn't just steal income, it stole safety. Clients who once treated you with flattery now barely looked your way, or worse, mocked you. Other workers sometimes avoided older women, afraid their misfortune might rub off. Age became a stain. You weren't mysterious or mature, you were used up. In some houses, older women were openly pushed out. Not fired exactly, just starved of work until they left on their own. And for the brothel itself, aging was a branding problem. Sex appeal sold, and youth was the easiest bait. That's why so many establishments lined their halls with the youngest faces up front. The newer hires in the best gowns. The older workers kept to the back rooms or the day shift when traffic was thinner. Even madams participated in the illusion, painting their faces smooth, tying their corsets tighter, claiming to be barely 30, when everyone in the house knew she'd delivered twins back when the plague first swept through town. There's a quiet cruelty in it. The way these women who had given their best years, sometimes their only years, to the trade were slowly erased from it. Not through scandal or punishment, but through the simple, unrelenting march of time. Still, some resisted. Some older workers embraced their experience, offering companionship over novelty, conversation over acrobatics. They catered to clients who wanted more than just skin, men who were lonely, or widowed, or too tired for the chase. These women charged more for listening, for silence, for knowing when to pour another cup of wine and when to leave it empty. There's a fringe tale from Rouen of a woman named Colette, who claimed to be the oldest lover in France. She wore black veils, smoked herbs from a carved pipe, and whispered poetry in 3 languages. She charged twice as much as the younger girls and had a waiting list. No one knew her real age, or cared. And some older women fought back in quieter ways, mentoring the younger workers, passing down tricks and warnings, protecting them from cruel clients or crooked guards. They became unofficial mothers in a place where no one ever got to be a mother. Not fully, not safely. Historians still debate how widespread these experiences were. Some argue that the average brothel worker didn't live long enough to age out. Others suggest that many transitioned smoothly into other trades or relationships, but fragments of letters, records, and oral traditions suggest something else, that many just disappeared. Not dramatically, just slowly. One day no longer at the table, one day no longer behind the curtain, and no one talked about it. That's the part that lingers. The silence. Because the brothel wasn't built for old age. It wasn't designed to hold women past their peak. It consumed youth, converted it into coin, and moved on. But within those walls some women held on anyway, clung to scraps of dignity, found moments of love, stared back at the mirror and whispered, "Still here?" So tonight, as you hear footsteps past the door, heavier, slower, the tread of someone who's walked this floor 1,000 times, remember her. Not the girl in the lace, not the one giggling on the client's lap, the one with the tired eyes, the steady hand, the voice that's seen too much. She's not gone yet, and she's got stories you wouldn't believe. There's a hush tonight that isn't fear or fatigue. It's anticipation, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck. Someone's arriving. Word travelled ahead. A carriage spotted outside the gates, liveried guards on horseback, crests barely covered under dust-stained cloaks. The brothel is scrambling, not to hide anything, but to shine everything. The candles are lit, the finest wine is uncorked, and the newest girl has been bathed twice, even though she's still shaking. Because when a noble visits, especially one with power, everything changes. This isn't just about status, it's about survival. Nobles were dangerous clients, not because they were violent, though some were, but because they didn't have to follow the rules. They could buy silence. They could demand anything. And if something went wrong, well, it was never their name that ended up on the warrant. So tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the elite customers, those who entered brothels not in secrecy but with entitlement, and how their presence shaped everything, from business to fear. Let's be clear, nobles loved brothels. Kings, dukes, bishops, knights, fresh off campaigns, they all came, often loudly, often in groups. It was a place to flaunt power, to indulge without consequence, to escape courtly decorum in favour of something stickier. In some cities, noble brothel attendance was so routine it became a performance. They'd arrive with fanfare, throwing coins to street urchins, demanding music, sending servants ahead to prepare the girls. It wasn't secrecy they wanted, it was spectacle, and the brothel adapted, quickly. When nobles were expected, madams reallocated everything. The best rooms were cleaned top to bottom. The most polished workers were assigned, often whether they wanted to be or not. Wine was upgraded, beds were turned down, perfume flowed like prayer, and the price doubled at least. Nobles didn't haggle. They paid, if not in coin, then in favours. But that favour was a double-edged blade. On one side, yes, a noble patron could protect a brothel. They could argue down a city fine, or donate anonymously to cover taxes. Some brothels proudly displayed crests on their mantles or discreetly stitched symbols into curtains, marks of affiliation. It made them untouchable in theory. On the other side, a noble could destroy a house with a single whisper, if a client died under suspicious circumstances, if a servant overheard too much, if a girl got pregnant and thought for 1 second she might ask for support. The noble would vanish, and suddenly the brothel found itself under scrutiny. Inspections, raids, accusations of corruption or witchcraft. Nobles could walk away, the brothel could not. One infamous case from Florence in 1434 involved a duke who hosted a private masquerade in the upper rooms of a well-known brothel. A servant overheard political gossip, names of rivals, hints of treason, and repeated it. Within days the brothel was closed, the madam arrested, the servant disappeared, the duke promoted to ambassador, and then there were the requests. Nobles didn't just want pleasure, they wanted control. They brought outfits, scripts, demands that blurred into the cruel. Some wanted reenactments of childhood traumas, some wanted blood, some wanted nothing more than to lie beside someone who wouldn't talk back, even if it meant she was gagged. And the girls couldn't say no, not easily. Not when the man in the room could buy a dozen more of you before breakfast. Still, some women learned how to turn noble visits to their advantage. They flattered strategically, listened carefully. Some became confidants, lovers even. Not always romantically, but politically. A well-placed word, a well-timed secret, could keep the house safe for months. There's a recorded case in Paris of a brothel worker named Isabeau, who brokered peace between two rival lords through pillow talk. She lived like a queen for 6 months before disappearing under unclear circumstances. Nobles also influenced fashion. When a countess began painting her lips with crushed berries, suddenly the brothel girls did too. When a knight arrived with silk from the east, the madam tracked down the same fabric within a week. Nobility brought trends, gossip, even language. Some brothel workers learned multiple tongues, French, Latin, even Arabic, just to keep up. And then there were the clients who weren't nobles, but pretended to be. They'd arrive with borrowed cloaks, fake crests, big talk about titles that didn't exist. The girls usually spotted them quickly. The boots gave it away. A real noble's boots were polished and hand-stitched. The fakes were soft at the heel, like he'd been walking instead of riding. But the madam often let it slide. Let the man feel powerful, let him spend like he was wealthy. Then gently reminded him, when payment was due, that his lordly generosity should match his stories. There's even a fringe account of a brothel in Bordeaux that offered discounts for actual nobles, but charged double to anyone claiming to be one. A running joke, but also a trap. If you said you were a duke and then couldn't pay the duke's rate, that was fraud, and the madam had a cousin in the city guard. Of course, not all noble visits ended in drama. Some clients were respectful, some were kind. A few even supported children born from these visits, quietly, generously. But these were exceptions, not rules. Most nobles treated brothels like theatres where they were the only audience, and the only critic. And for the workers, these visits brought both terror and opportunity. A noble might lift you out of the brothel for a few weeks, take you to a country manor, drape you in velvet. But he might also forget your name before morning, might leave bruises, might ruin you. And if he did, who would believe you? There's ongoing scholarly debate about how much political influence brothels had through their noble clients. Some argue they were hotbeds of soft power, with women shaping policy through whispered influence. Others suggest that's a romantic fantasy. Brothels didn't shape politics, they were shaped by it, used and discarded like so much else. But either way, the presence of nobility left fingerprints, on the rooms, on the routines, on the faces of the women who had to smile a little harder when a crest showed up on a carriage door. So tonight, as the front curtain lifts and a cloaked figure steps into the candlelight, don't just look at the gold ring on his hand or the furs on his shoulders. Look at the way the girls stiffen. Look at the madam's eyes as she calculates risk in real time. Look at the silence that settles like a frost. Because when power walks in, it doesn't knock, it just expects. By now, you know the creak of the floorboards in this place, the smell of old wood soaked with wine and sweat and lavender oil. You know which stair groans when someone sneaks up at night, and which window never shuts all the way. But tonight is different. Not because of a client, not because of a raid, because of you. You've been here long enough to see through the walls, past the costumes. And what you're seeing now? The ghosts, not the white sheet kind, the real ones, the echoes, the weight, the history pressed into the fabric of the place like a second skin. Because when a brothel lives for long enough, it collects more than debts and perfume bottles. It gathers stories, and those stories don't vanish. They linger, in the quiet, in the ritual, in the pauses between one moan and the next. So tonight we're going to sit with those ghosts. There's the girl who came here dressed as a boy, because it was safer. She worked 2 years before someone figured it out, and by then no one cared. She had soft hands and a sharper tongue, and every client left confused but oddly pleased. She died during the coldest winter anyone remembered, wrapped in a coat someone else stole before dawn. No one even remembers her real name, just the blue ribbon she always wore around her boot. There's the woman who saved up every coin she ever made, buried them in clay jars under her mattress, and ran away with the travelling scribe. Rumour says she married him, bore 3 daughters, and taught them all to read, because she had never learned. Her name still shows up in old ledgers, circled 3 times with a note beside it. Paid in full, never returned. The madam kept the ledger like a charm, a rare ending that didn't rot. There's the man who came every week just to talk. He'd lost his wife in childbirth, spent years alone. He brought gifts, badly carved wooden birds, dried apples, little trinkets no one needed. The girls laughed behind his back, but took the apples anyway. When he stopped showing up, they lit a candle for him. Not because they missed the birds, because no one else would. Some ghosts are louder. There was a raid once in this very building. You can still see the scorch mark on the ceiling beam. A guard broke a lantern during the chaos. A girl, Anna maybe, pushed her friend out the back window but got caught in the smoke herself. The madam didn't speak for 3 days after. Then one night she took every cushion in the house and threw them into the fire. Said they smelled like sorrow. They replaced them the next day. But no one sat on them without shifting uncomfortably for weeks. And then there's the ritual. Every house has one. A thing they do without really knowing why. In this one, it's the red string, tied to the door handle at night, a bit frayed, stained, but always there. They say it started after a client returned drunk and violent, and no one heard the girl's screams until too late. Now, the string means someone's working. If it's untied, the room is empty. If it's doubled, something's wrong. No one wrote it down. It just became part of the place, like the chipped stair and the perfume drawer with the broken latch. These ghosts don't moan, they don't wail, they just exist. In the stories told between sips of wine, in the way a girl touches the wall as she walks down the hall like she's steadying herself on the past. In the songs they hum without realising, old tunes passed down from worker to worker until no one remembers where they started. And some ghosts, they're not dead, just gone. Women who left one day and never returned. Maybe they married, maybe they were arrested, maybe they crossed the wrong man. The brothel doesn't keep photos or paintings, but memories survive. The madam can still list their habits like inventory. Greta always braided her hair twice, hated cardamom, knew how to fake a limp if the client liked pity. Those fragments are all that's left. There's a fringe belief, still whispered in certain circles, that brothels hold a kind of magic. Not the spellbook kind, the memory kind. That a house which has absorbed so much intimacy, pain, power and vulnerability becomes a sort of living being. That if you sit quietly enough, long enough, you'll feel the ones who came before you. That's why some madams refuse to move the furniture. Why some rooms are never repainted, even when the walls start to peel. To erase the past would be to insult the house, to disrespect its ghosts. Some scholars argue this is superstition, folklore born from trauma. Others say it's just nostalgia, romanticising a grim trade. But neither theory explains the patterns, the little rituals, the names scratched into beams, the coins left under mattresses long after their owner is gone. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the brothel does. And you've walked its halls. You've heard the floorboards creak, seen the shadows move just slightly when no one's there. You've watched a girl sit by a window, with tears she couldn't explain, and hum a lullaby that didn't belong to her. Maybe it belonged to someone buried in crossbones. Maybe it was hers in another life. What's certain is this: the brothel doesn't forget. No matter how the city changes, no matter how the names and faces blur, it remembers. The ones who worked, the ones who laughed, the ones who didn't make it out. So tonight, as the fire burns low and the last candle flickers in its stub of wax, take a moment. Close your eyes. And if you feel something old, something soft, something sorrowful, don't be afraid. You're just sharing the room. And now the house is quiet. The doors are bolted, the curtains drawn. Somewhere a lone candle still flickers on a windowsill, just enough light to remind the night that someone's awake. The laughter has faded. The coin has been counted. The perfume's worn off. What's left is the echo. A heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing through floorboards soaked in centuries of secrets. You've walked every hallway, leaned on every windowsill, peeked behind every locked door. You've seen the truth. More than just the trade, more than just scandal or shame. You've seen people. Clever, defiant, wounded, beautiful in ways no painting ever captured. You've seen survival dressed up in silk and sarcasm. You've seen power where no one expected to find it. The medieval brothel wasn't just a place where sin lived. It was a stage, a shelter, a trap, a home. It was where women carved out space for themselves in a world that rarely gave them anything else. Where laughter was a weapon, and every flirtation masked calculation. Where danger and delight shared a bed, and the past never really left the room. And maybe, just maybe, you'll never think of it quite the same way again. So wherever you are, candle lit, fan humming in the background, night pressing gently at your window, take one last breath with me. Let it out slowly. No rush. Close your eyes if you haven't already. The city's asleep now. Even the ghosts are resting. Thanks for staying with me through the whole journey, really. Sleep well tonight.